Section 1. The Boy from Kent, where it all began. There is a small, quiet town in northwestern Connecticut called Kent. It sits between forested hills, the kind of place where seasons actually mean something, where autumn smells like wood smoke and damp leaves, where winter settles in hard and gray, and where summer afternoons stretch out long and golden over fields that barely move. It is the kind of town you could drive through and forget about in 20 minutes. Most people do. But one person who grew up there could not forget it, because it gave him everything he needed to eventually build one of the most bizarre, layered, controversial, and beloved fictional worlds ever put on television. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut, to Ronald Milton MacFarlane, a prep school teacher, and Anne Perry Sager, who worked in academic administration. His sister, Rachael MacFarlane, would eventually follow him into voice acting and become a recognizable presence in animation herself. The household Seth grew up in was not a particularly Hollywood one. It was a New England house full of books, classical music, Broadway records, and the kind of general cultural richness that comes when both of your parents are educators. His father brought home literature. His mother played him cast albums. The family listened to Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Miller on old vinyl that his grandfather passed down. Long before Seth MacFarlane had any idea what he was going to do with his life, music was being threaded into the fibers of who he was, and it would show up in every single thing he made later on. He started drawing cartoons at the age of 2. Not scribbles, actual cartoons. He had seen Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone on television, and something lit up in him that never really went dark again. By the time he was 8 years old, he was writing and drawing his own comic strip called Walter Crouton, and it was actually being published in the Kent Dispatch, his local Connecticut newspaper. Think about that for a moment. An 8-year-old with a published comic strip. There was never really a question of what this person was going to do. The question was only ever how far he was going to take it. Throughout high school, he kept drawing, kept creating, kept consuming animation with a depth of attention that most people reserve for things they are formally studying. He knew the names of animators. He studied how characters moved, how timing worked in comedy, how a held expression for one extra beat could shift a joke from flat to funny. He was not watching cartoons, he was studying them, even if he could not have used that word for it at the time. When it came time to think about what came after high school, MacFarlane enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, known simply as RISD, one of the most respected art schools in the country. He majored in animation, and it was here, in Providence, Rhode Island, that the geography around him began to quietly seep into what would eventually become the Griffin family's world, the streets of Providence, the specific architecture of a New England city, the particular rhythm of the people who grew up in and around that part of the country. All of it went in. He was absorbing without knowing he was absorbing. At RISD, he did stand-up comedy in his spare time. He made short films with classmates. He met Mike Henry, whose brother Patrick was MacFarlane's classmate. And Mike Henry would later become one of the most important members of the Family Guy voice cast, bringing Cleveland Brown, Herbert the Pervert, Consuela, and Bruce to life. These connections were not planned. They were the natural accumulation of a creative person surrounded by other creative people, all of them figuring out what they were making and who they were becoming. In his senior year, MacFarlane made his thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry. And if you have ever seen it, if you have ever tracked down that student film on the internet and sat with it for a few minutes, what you are watching is not just a student project. You were watching the raw, unpolished skeleton of something that would eventually grow into one of the longest-running animated shows in television history. The film features a middle-aged, overweight, not particularly sharp man named Larry Cummings. He has a talking dog named Steve. He has a patient wife named Lois. He has a son. The whole thing runs a handful of minutes, and it is rough in the way all student films are rough. The animation is not clean. Some of the jokes land and some of them don't. But the sensibility is completely unmistakably there. The rhythm is there. The cutaway energy is there. Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin were hiding inside Larry and Steve, just waiting for someone to let them out. MacFarlane drew Peter's voice from a real person, a security guard he overheard talking while he was at RISD. There was something about the sound of that voice, the cadence of it, the particular New England working-class quality to it that stuck in his head. He kept it. He built a character around it. The voice of one of the most recognizable animated characters in history came from an unnamed security guard who probably had no idea he was being absorbed into someone's. Creative memory. A professor at RISD, recognizing that the thesis film was something worth paying attention to, submitted The Life of Larry to Hanna-Barbera, the studio behind some of the most iconic cartoons in American history. The Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear. Hanna-Barbera, in one of the more consequential decisions a development executive has ever made, reached out to MacFarlane while he was still a student and recruited him. He graduated in 1995 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, packed up, and moved to Los Angeles. At Hanna-Barbera, which had by that point been absorbed into Cartoon Network Studios, MacFarlane worked as a writer and animator on shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Cow and Chicken, I Am Weasel, and most substantially, Johnny Bravo. He spent the most time on Johnny Bravo, and the environment of that show where scripts were the center of the creative process in a way they were not on some of the other productions helped him develop the writing muscles he would need. He was learning the architecture of animated comedy from the inside. He was also still quietly working on his own thing in whatever time he could find. In 1996, he made a sequel to The Life of Larry. He called it Larry and Steve. This one was slightly more polished, slightly sharper, and it featured a clearer version of what would become the Brian Griffin character. Cartoon Network broadcast it as part of their world premiere Toons block. And the executives at Fox, who had been watching, paying attention in ways that usually only happen when someone is already very good at what they do, saw it. They called him in. Fox's initial idea was to use him for Mad TV, their sketch comedy show. They wanted him to make short animated segments to run between sketches. The deal fell apart. But Fox, not wanting to lose him, offered something else. They gave him $50,000 and asked him to produce a short demonstration pilot for a potential animated series. This was not a guarantee. This was a test. The money was small. The timeline was tight. And Seth MacFarlane took it, sat down in his kitchen, and started drawing. He later described those 6 months as some of the most intense of his life. No sleep, almost no social life. Just drawing, writing, recording voices, building this thing piece by piece in his apartment kitchen. He was doing it almost entirely alone. The finished product was a 15-minute animated pilot featuring the Griffin family living in a Rhode Island town, going through a story that combined silly humor, warm family dynamics, dark edge, and those rapid-fire associative cutaway jokes that would become the show's signature. He pitched it to Fox on May 15, 1998. Fox greenlit it immediately. They did not ask him to change much. They asked him to expand it into a full series. And on January 31st, 1999, the night of Super Bowl 33, with somewhere between 22 million and 25 million people already parked in front of their televisions after watching the Denver Broncos beat the Atlanta Falcons, Family Guy premiered. At 25 years old, Seth MacFarlane became the youngest executive producer in the history of network television. Not just the youngest at Fox, the youngest in the entire industry. The show's setting, the fictional city the Griffin family calls home in Rhode Island, was built from real geography. The buildings visible behind the Griffin house and early establishing shots are based on actual structures in downtown Providence. The name of the Griffin family's street, Spooner Street, is a real street name in Providence. The bars and diners and shops of the world MacFarlane was drawing were never invented from nothing. They were reconstructed from memory. From those years of walking around Providence as a student, absorbing the particular texture of that place. The name of the town itself, the place where the Griffins live, comes from a real Rhode Island city. Rhode Island is actually home to a place called North Kingstown, which contains a village historically known as Wickford. But more prominently, the region has deep historical ties to colonial Rhode Island's founding. The name for the Griffins' hometown was drawn from that region's history, fitting perfectly into the show's Rhode Island identity. The Griffin family, in those earliest episodes, was built with real intention. Peter was based on a type of man MacFarlane knew intimately from growing up in New England. The loud, big-hearted, working-class guy who says things without thinking them through, who would give you everything he had and also accidentally ruin your life in the same afternoon. MacFarlane has described Peter as having zero self-editing mechanism and a heart that is genuinely good underneath all the noise. That combination, that gap between the man's intentions and his execution, is what made early Peter so funny without being unlikable. Lois came from Archie Bunker's wife Edith, to some degree the patient, sensible counterweight to a loudmouth husband. But MacFarlane built her into something more interesting than a simple reactor. Lois came from a wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, and that backstory gave her a layer the show would return to regularly. She could have had a very different life. She chose this one. Meg was a deliberate choice. Every family needed the ordinary one. In a house where the baby was plotting world domination and the dog was drinking martinis and quoting Chekhov, someone had to represent the relatable. Meg was that person, and in those early episodes, she actually functioned as a legitimate character. A real teenage girl trying to navigate high school while living in an insane house. Chris was drawn partly from MacFarlane's own sense of the aimless, sweet-natured teenage boy. Big, a little clueless, not mean, not driven, just trying to figure things out. His voice actor Seth Green famously got the part by doing an impression of Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs during his audition. Someone dared him to try it. He did. They gave him the job. Later, the show paid tribute to this fact in an episode where Meg shows a video of Chris doing exactly that dance in front of a mirror, connecting the fictional moment back to the real casting story. Brian was the hardest character to get right, and possibly the most important one. He was the grounding mechanism in a show that was going to go absolutely everywhere, backward through time, sideways into parody, underneath pop culture, inside obscure historical moments. You needed at least one character whose job was to acknowledge that the world still had rules and logic. Brian was that character. He drank martinis. He smoked. He drove a car. He wrote a novel he could never finish. He was witty and sarcastic and loyal and a little bit sad. His voice came from MacFarlane's natural speaking register, not a character voice. Brian sounded most like Seth MacFarlane himself talking. And then there was Stewie. Stewie Griffin was, from the very beginning, the most audacious idea in the entire show. MacFarlane has said that Stewie started as just a shapeless drawing of a baby, no personality. He needed something that would give the character an identity. He was a fan of Rex Harrison, specifically Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, the way he talked, the imperious delivery, the theatrical precision of it, that mid-century British authority. He put Rex Harrison's voice into the body of an infant in a football-shaped head, sitting in a high chair eating Gerber food and plotting the eradication of all human life on Earth. It was insane. It worked completely. The premise behind Stewie that he was an evil genius operating in complete obscurity because the adults around him were too busy or too distracted to actually hear what he was saying introduced a structural comedy device that the show would rely on for years. Most characters could not understand Stewie. They heard babbling. The audience heard monologues about orbital death lasers and temporal paradoxes. That gap, that irony, was the engine of 100 jokes. Brian could hear Stewie. This was the seed of one of the great animated friendships in television history. Not a typical mentor and student dynamic. Not a parent and child. Not quite equals. But something genuinely novel. A talking dog and an evil baby who recognized in each other the only company worth keeping in a house full of chaos. And the show that launched out of all this, that premiered to 22 million people on a January night in 1999, was genuinely something. It was something its creator had been building since he was 2 years old, drawing cartoons in a small Connecticut town. And none of it was an accident. Drop a comment right now and tell me where and what time you are watching this from. I love knowing who is here and when. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the button is right there. It's free. It takes 2 seconds, and it means a lot. Section 2. Building the World, Spooner Street, The Drunken Clam, and the Geography of Fiction. Every great fictional world has rules that the audience absorbs without realizing it, a kind of invisible architecture that gives every scene a floor to stand on. Springfield in The Simpsons has its, Pawnee in Parks and Recreation has its, and the Rhode Island city where the Griffins live has its own, built piece by piece from a combination of real geography, deliberate world-building decisions, and accumulated creative choices that hardened into canon over 2 decades of episodes. The city the Griffins call home sits somewhere in Rhode Island, and it was constructed from MacFarlane's genuine experience of that part of New England. He did not invent the textures of it. He remembered them, the cramped older neighborhoods, the neighborhood bar that functions as a kind of secular community center, the proximity of very different economic worlds, wealthy old new, England money and working-class neighborhoods separated by a few blocks. All of that is Rhode Island. All of it is real. And it gave the show's fictional world a solidity that pure invention rarely achieves. The Griffin family lives at 31 Spooner Street. The street was named after a real street in Providence, Rhode Island. The house itself, a 2-story structure with a distinctive color scheme and a small backyard, became one of the most recognizable fictional residences in American animation. Alongside 742 Evergreen Terrace in Springfield and 1313 Mockingbird Lane, the interior layout of the house evolved slightly in the earliest seasons, which is not unusual for animated shows still finding their visual footing. The kitchen, the living room, the stairs, these became so familiar to regular viewers that even minor background details noticed by eagle-eyed fans over the years have generated serious discussion in the show's online community. The buildings visible in the show's establishing shots, the ones you see when the camera pulls back to show the neighborhood context, were based on real downtown Providence. Architecture. MacFarlane instructed the visual team to draw from actual Providence buildings. This was not mere aesthetic choice. It was a grounding mechanism. When the show went completely surreal, as it regularly did, having an anchor in recognizable, real-feeling geography gave those moments their full comedic force. The Drunken Clam Bar, where Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire spend enormous amounts of time together, is the show's central gathering place for the male characters. It was designed as a classic New England dive bar. Not polished, not trendy, just a place where people go because they have always gone there, where the stools are worn and the beer is cold and nobody asks you how your day is going unless they actually want to know. The bar has its own regulars beyond the main group. It has its own ecosystem. In the early seasons especially, the conversations that happened in the Drunken Clam had a rhythm and a warmth that made the group feel genuinely like friends rather than characters sharing scenes. The bar's name itself is a small piece of geography storytelling. Clams are culturally significant in New England, specifically Rhode Island, where clam chowder is a point of regional pride and clam bakes are a genuine social institution. Naming the neighborhood bar after a drunken clam was not an accident. It placed the show in a specific cultural register that people who grew up in that part of the country would recognize instantly. The neighborhood itself, Spooner Street and the surrounding blocks, operates as a kind of compressed New England suburb where several distinct character types coexist. You have the Swansons to one side, Joe being the neighborhood cop, Bonnie being the patient wife who spent an extraordinary number of episodes pregnant. Bonnie Swanson was pregnant for a total of 116 episodes across roughly 7 seasons. This is one of the most discussed continuity quirks in the show's history and became an intentional running gag long after it started as an oversight. When Bonnie finally gave birth to baby Susie in season 7, fans had been waiting for it so long that the event carried genuine comedic weight. The Quagmires, or rather just Glenn Quagmire, who lived alone next door, represented the bachelor neighbor archetype. The single guy in every neighborhood who the parents aren't entirely sure they want their kids spending too much time around. Quagmire's character was built from a very specific mid-century American masculine archetype, the swaggering bachelor pilot, the Rat Pack-adjacent Lothario, the guy who treats life as a series of conquests. MacFarlane drew his voice from 1940s and 1950s radio commercials and early television, that fast-talking, hyper-confident delivery that felt like it belonged to a different era. In context, surrounded by characters from the late 1990s and early 2000s, that anachronistic energy was part of what made Quagmire funny. Cleveland Brown and his wife Loretta lived across the street in the earliest seasons. Cleveland's character was built as the moral center of the friend group, the gentle, measured voice of reason who was genuinely good-natured in a way that distinguished him from both Peter's chaos and Quagmire's recklessness. Mike Henry, who voiced Cleveland, brought a warmth and a specific southern quality to the character that felt real and lived in. Cleveland's famous bathtub gag, where he would be taking a bath in his upstairs bathroom, something would crash through the floor beneath him, and he would fall through still in. The tub, always announcing the fall with the same line, became one of the show's most beloved running gags. It was so beloved that when Cleveland eventually got his own spin-off show and moved away from the street, the show found a way to bring the bathtub gag with him. Because some things are just too good to leave behind. The wider world of the show is populated with recurring locations that each carry their own character. James Woods High School, where Meg and Chris attend, is named after the actor James Woods, who appeared so many times on the show in recurring appearances that the school naming felt like a piece of the world acknowledging its own favorite recurring joke. The school is drawn with the specific atmosphere of a New England public high school, institutional, slightly underfunded, the kind of place where teachers have long given up on certain students and have become philosophically relaxed about their own disillusionment. Quahog 5 News, the local television news station, gave the show a media presence that mirrored real local news in all its particular textures. Tom Tucker, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, in a deep, pompous anchor voice, and his co-anchor Diane Simmons formed a pairing that skewered local news culture in ways that were both affectionate and sharp. The news segments became a recurring framing device, a way to introduce the world's response to whatever Peter had done, a kind of Greek chorus wrapped in a suit and sitting. Behind a desk, Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's physician, is one of those supporting characters who accumulated significance gradually, episode by episode, until he became genuinely indispensable. His incompetence as a doctor was one of those background running gags that the show could pull up anytime it needed medical humor. MacFarlane voices him, and interestingly, Dr. Hartman's voice is very close to Carter Pewterschmidt's voice, Lois's wealthy, withering father, also voiced by MacFarlane, and in a Season 6 episode the show actually acknowledged this out loud, having the two characters meet and comment on the similarity, a self-referential joke that required MacFarlane to essentially do an impression of himself doing an impression. Herbert the Pervert, voiced with extraordinary commitment by Mike Henry in a thin, papery old man voice that is both unsettling and somehow deeply funny in context, became one of the most talked about recurring characters on the show. Herbert lives down the street, has a deeply inappropriate interest in Chris, and appears in the background of scenes or at the edges of episodes in moments that are technically disturbing but land as dark comedy because of the specificity and consistency of the character's voice and delivery. Henry has said in interviews that the voice came to him almost complete from the first attempt. Some voices arrive like that. Mayor Adam West was one of those casting choices that functions on multiple levels simultaneously. The actual Adam West, who played Batman in the classic 1960s television series, voiced Mayor Adam West, the completely unhinged mayor of the Griffins' hometown. The joke operates on two levels. First, it is funny that a once iconic TV superhero is now voicing a bumbling small-town mayor. And second, the character of Mayor Adam West is so specifically written that he could only be voiced by Adam West because West had the rare ability to play absolute absurdity completely deadpan, without any winking at the camera. West appeared in the show from the beginning all the way until his death in June 2017, and after his passing, the show handled his character's departure with a genuine tenderness. That surprised people who did not expect that kind of grace from a show with Family Guy's reputation. The fabric of the show's fictional city grew richer with every season. New locations accumulated, new recurring characters moved in at the edges. Background details became more and more intricate as the production team clearly took pleasure in hiding things for attentive viewers to find. A famous one, in episodes where the Griffins are shown watching the news or reading a newspaper, the background text in those props almost always contains jokes, readable only. To people who paused their DVD players, one such joke, discovered by fans pausing their discs, read, DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. This kind of thing was not required. Nobody mandated it. The show's artists put it there because they could. Because they were making something and they wanted to put their energy into every visible corner of it. The sheet music that appears above Lois's piano in the family living room, visible in numerous episodes and in the show's opening title sequence, is the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. If you could read music and could zoom in on those pages, you would find the actual notation for the notes being played. This is one of those details that represents the difference between making something and making something with genuine care. Nobody asked for it. Nobody would have noticed if it were just random squiggles on those pages. But someone put the real music there anyway. The layout of the show's world also includes Providence's actual surrounding geography in its DNA. The nearby Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the fictional beer brand that Peter works for and that becomes his professional home base for much of the show's run, was modeled after. The tradition of small New England breweries that are deeply embedded in regional identity. Pawtucket itself is a real city in Rhode Island, and the brewery's name folded Rhode Island geography directly into the show's economic world. One detail that rewards close attention: the exterior of the Griffin home changes subtly across seasons. The color of the house, the details of the yard, minor architectural elements have shifted. Some of these changes were intentional retcons or updates. Others were continuity errors that accumulated over decades of production. The show's fans have cataloged these variations with extraordinary precision, and the catalog of those differences tells its own story about how the visual language of the show evolved from the relatively rough original production to the smoother, more standardized look of later seasons. The world also expanded outward in specific episodes in ways that revealed the Griffin family's wider world. Field trips to Washington, New York, Europe, the past, the future, parallel universes, the afterlife, the inside of Peter's body. The show treated its fictional geography as infinitely expandable rather than a fixed container. But the home on Spooner Street was always the anchor. No matter how far the characters traveled, no matter how surreal the journey got, they always came back to that living room couch, that kitchen table, that backyard. The house on Spooner Street was not just a setting. It was the show's gravitational center. Section 3. The Voices. An intimate history of who gives life to the Griffins. Voice acting is one of those arts that most people encounter constantly without ever thinking too hard about. A voice actor's job is to disappear so completely into a character that the audience stops thinking about the person behind the microphone and simply accepts the character as real. When it works, when it truly works, the voice becomes the character, and the character becomes so real that the voice actor's own face and body seem almost irrelevant. Family Guy has produced some of the great examples of this phenomenon in the history of animated television. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's 6 main characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn Quagmire. Each of these voices is genuinely distinct. Each one came from a different place, a different reference point, a different piece of MacFarlane's vast archive of cultural memory. The fact that he can switch between all 4 in the same recording session, and in the case of episodes where Peter and Brian have conversations, or Stewie and Peter interact, he is in a sense performing opposite himself, is a technical achievement that tends to get overlooked because the end result sounds so effortless. Peter's voice, as mentioned in the previous section, came from a real person. MacFarlane overheard a security guard at wrist talking, the broad New England vowels, the specific rhythmic weight of the working-class Bostonian-adjacent accent. The way certain phrases landed with a particular kind of earnest confidence. He held on to it. By the time he was recording the pilot, the voice was fully formed. What he added on top of the borrowed accent was a comedic delivery style, a particular way of slightly overstressing syllables for emphasis, a comic timing built on landing. Punchlines with just slightly too much sincerity, which is its own form of irony. Stewie's voice came from Rex Harrison, specifically his performance as Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. MacFarlane was a genuine fan of Harrison's work, of that very particular mid-century British theatrical quality, imperious, precise, somewhat contemptuous, completely confident. Put that voice in the body of an infant, and the comic dissonance practically writes itself. The choice to keep Stewie's accent consistent and refined even when he is doing extremely undignified things, crying, having a tantrum, demanding his stuffed bear back, is part of what makes the character work so reliably. The contrast never stops being funny. Brian's voice is the simplest of the 4, and in some ways the most interesting. MacFarlane has said that Brian's voice is closest to his own natural speaking register. There is no character affect layered on top. Brian sounds like Seth MacFarlane talking. This was a deliberate choice. Brian was the grounding character, the realistic anchor, and it means that whenever Brian speaks, there is a quality to the delivery that is slightly different from the others, a directness and a simplicity that registers subconsciously as naturalness. The audience trusts Brian in part because his voice doesn't sound like a performance. Quagmire's voice was built from 1940s and 1950s American commercial radio culture. MacFarlane is a student of that era, deeply familiar with the specific delivery style of announcers and hosts from the period. The bright, punchy, slightly artificial energy, the way syllables were shaped for maximum auditory impact in an era before audio technology could compensate for weak delivery. He took that style and pushed it forward in time, putting it in the body of a character whose behavior was thoroughly, comically contemporary. The result is a voice that sounds like it stepped out of a 1953 NBC broadcast and landed in a bar in modern Rhode Island, which is somehow exactly what it needs to be. Alex Borstein voices Lois Griffin. Borstein was a cast member on Mad TV when she was asked to audition for the Family Guy pilot. She has said that she had not met MacFarlane and had not seen any of his work before the audition. It was entirely sight unseen. She was performing in a stage show at the time and did the audition essentially on the fly, basing the character's voice on a real person in her life, a cousin, whose specific speech pattern she had been carrying around in her memory. The voice she brought to Lois, that particular slightly nasal, slightly flat, patient but not infinitely so quality, was not invented in an audition room. It was borrowed from someone who probably has no idea that a version of her voice has been on television for over 2 decades. Seth Green voices Chris Griffin. Green was relatively well known when he was cast. He had done significant work in film and television by the late 1990s. And he was also already associated with Seth. MacFarlane's creative circle. The casting story for Chris is one of those pieces of behind-the-scenes history that the show itself eventually acknowledged. When Green auditioned, someone dared him to try doing his impression of Buffalo Bill, the villain from The Silence of the Lambs. It is a deeply strange choice for auditioning for a teenage animated character, but Green committed to it completely. MacFarlane loved it and cast him on the strength of that impression. Later, in an episode where Meg tries to embarrass Chris in front of his peers, she shows a video of him doing the Buffalo Bill dance from the same film. The show acknowledged its own casting history as a joke, folding the real world and the fictional world together in one quiet self-referential moment. Mila Kunis took over the role of Meg Griffin from Lacey Chabert after the first season. Chabert had voiced Meg in the original 14 produced episodes, but she was simultaneously committed to her role on Party of Five and had school obligations, and the conflicts became unmanageable. Chabert departed the role, and Kunis, who was already well known as Jackie on that 70s show, came in. Kunis has said that when she auditioned, she called back and MacFarlane told her to speak more slowly, that her natural delivery was too fast and needed to settle down for the character to work. She adjusted and got the part. The transition between the two voices for Meg is subtle enough that most viewers who were not paying close attention never registered that a change had happened. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, brings a very specific quality to the character that nothing else about the casting could have provided. Warburton is a large man with a famously deep, authoritative voice, and he plays Joe, the wheelchair, using police officer neighbor, with a particular combination of toughness and pathos that gives the character dimensions beyond what the script alone would provide. Joe was introduced in the first season as the cool new neighbor that everyone admired. He was capable, competent, respected, and his being in a wheelchair was part of his characterization without being the definition of it. Warburton's delivery invested Joe with genuine dignity in those early episodes that made the later seasons' treatment of the character as a figure of mockery feel more jarring in. Retrospect. Mike Henry, who voices Cleveland Brown, Herbert, Bruce the performance artist, and Consuela the cleaning woman, represents one of the most extraordinary ranges in the cast. Each of those voices comes from a completely different place, serves a completely different comedic purpose, and lands completely differently on the ear. Henry is not simply a voice actor on Family Guy. He is a writer, producer, and one of the most important creative forces behind the entire enterprise, having been involved since the very beginning through his personal friendship with MacFarlane that started at RISD. His decision to eventually step back from voicing Cleveland Brown after season 19, citing a broader cultural conversation about casting and representation, was one of the most discussed casting changes in the show's recent history, and Arif Zahir took over the role beginning in season 20. The guest voice cast over the show's entire run represents one of the most impressive rosters in animated television history. The show has featured, in no particular order, Carrie Fisher as Peter's boss Angela for many seasons, Rush Limbaugh playing himself in an early episode, in a casting choice that reflected the show's willingness to court controversy from all political directions. James Woods, who appeared so many times as himself that the recurring running joke of Peter and James Woods became one of the show's signature bits. Adam West, who as discussed appeared as the show's mayor until his passing. Patrick Stewart, who voices Susie Swanson. Joe and Bonnie's baby daughter in a casting choice so specific and so perfectly strange that it immediately became iconic, and hundreds more across the years. The Adam West story deserves its own deeper moment here. West came into the Family Guy universe in the very first season, and over the years he became one of the most important recurring presences on the show. Mayor Adam West was not meant to be a satire of Adam West the man. It was a character who simply happened to share a name with the famous actor. But because West was voicing him, and because West brought such a specific deadpan quality to the role, the character became inseparable from the performer. West was famously self-aware and self-deprecating about his post-Batman career, and he channeled that self-awareness into Mayor West in a way that made the character feel like both a tribute to and a gentle comedy examination of the experience of being a cultural icon who has outlived his own cultural moment. When West died on June 9, 2017, MacFarlane and the show responded with genuine warmth and grief. The season 16 premiere dedicated itself to the mayor's passing within the show's narrative, giving the character a send-off that honored West's 20 years of contribution. MacFarlane posted on social media that West was one of the most gracious, kind, and game people he had ever worked with, and that the loss was real, not just professional. Mayor West received a memorial in the show's opening title sequence for the season. It was a quieter, more sincere moment than Family Guy is typically associated with, and it said something real about what West meant to the people who made the show. The recording process for the show, how the voice sessions actually work, is worth a moment of attention because it shapes the final product in specific ways. The main cast records together rather than separately, which is relatively unusual in animated production. Many animated shows have their cast members record individually, alone in a booth, working from a script, and the episode is then assembled from those separate recordings in post-production. Family Guy's ensemble records together, which means the comedic timing, the organic back and forth, the moments when someone says something that makes everyone else in the booth laugh and that energy finds its way into the performance, all of that is possible. The chemistry between the actors is not manufactured by an editor. It is captured live. MacFarlane, recording in the same session for 4 different characters, has developed the ability to switch between Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire essentially in real time, responding to the other actors' deliveries and adjusting without losing track of which character's voice and register he is in. People who have watched recording sessions describe it as something close to a party trick, except that it is actually a professional skill refined over more than 2 decades of practice. The voice actors for Family Guy are, in the most literal sense, the show's most essential creative ingredient. The animation brings the characters to life visually, but it is the voice performances that make them feel like people rather than drawings. Section 4. The cancellation saga died twice, came back both times. There are stories in the history of television that sound too improbable to be real, the kind of thing. That would be dismissed as unrealistic if you pitched it as a film plot. A show premieres to 22 million viewers. Within 3 years, it is canceled twice. It spends 3 years completely off the air, broadcasting nothing, making nothing. And then it comes back, stronger than before, driven by forces that had never before been responsible for resurrecting a television show, and it becomes one of the longest running animated series in history. This is the story of what happened to Family Guy between 1999 and 2005. The first season of Family Guy performed well by any reasonable measure. It averaged approximately 8 million households tuning in each week, which placed it at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings for the 1999 to 2000 television season. For a brand new animated comedy on a network that was not yet certain what it had, those numbers were solid. The show was doing what it needed to do. The audience was finding it. Critical reception was genuinely enthusiastic, with reviewers highlighting the sharp writing, the distinctive humor, and the freshness of MacFarlane's voice. Nobody was predicting disaster. Then, Fox did something that would haunt their relationship with the show for years. In the second season, the network moved Family Guy from its established Sunday night slot, where it had found its footing and built its audience, to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Thursday at 9 p.m. meant direct competition with Frasier on NBC. Frasier in 2000 was at the peak of its cultural visibility, one of the most watched comedies on television, critical darling, Emmy magnet. Putting a brand new animated show up against Frasier was less a scheduling decision and more a slow-motion act of organizational confusion. The ratings dropped. Predictably, logically, inevitably. Viewers who had been finding Family Guy on Sundays now had to find it on Thursdays, and many of them did not. Then Fox moved it again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it ran against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. Millionaire was not just a hit at that moment. It was a phenomenon, one of those once-in-a-generation ratings events that absorbed the attention of tens of millions of people. Regardless of what else was available, Family Guy suffered again. Fox canceled the show after its second season in 2000, and then, in a last-minute decision that has never been fully explained to everyone's satisfaction, they renewed it for a third season. This brief reprieve produced some of the show's most celebrated early episodes. Then, Fox canceled it again in 2002. Third season finished, show over. MacFarlane and his writers went their separate ways. The writers, as MacFarlane would later point out with some frustration, moved on to other projects, as writers do when there is no show left to write for. The staff dispersed. Fox, having canceled the show, tried to sell the syndication rights to someone. This is standard industry practice. A canceled show that performed reasonably well in its original run still has value in reruns, and networks and studios try to capture that. Value by licensing the rerun rights to cable channels and local stations. Fox approached various outlets and found almost no interest. Family Guy was considered a damaged property. It had been canceled. The audience had not been passionate enough to save it. Nobody wanted it. Nobody, that is, except Cartoon Network, which acquired the rerun rights for what the president of 20th Century Fox Television later described as basically nothing. almost free. The rights were so devalued that Cartoon Network could afford to take a chance on them. Cartoon Network placed Family Guy on Adult Swim, the late-night block of programming aimed at adult viewers that ran from 11 p.m. onwards. Adult Swim in 2003 had already developed a passionate and engaged audience. People who stayed up late, who watched with genuine attention, who recommended shows to each other, with the kind of evangelical energy that networks dream about but rarely create deliberately. Family Guy, which had never quite found its full audience in its original Fox run, found that audience on Adult Swim. Family Guy premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. What happened next is one of the most discussed phenomena in the history of television ratings. The show did not simply perform well on Adult Swim. It became the highest-rated show on the entire block, dominating its time period against both cable and broadcast competition simultaneously. It boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. Let that number sit for a moment. Not 10%, not 20%, 239%. A show that Fox could not sell to anyone was nearly tripling the viewership of the platform that agreed to air it. Simultaneously, Fox's home entertainment division released DVD sets of Family Guy's first and second seasons in the same week that the Adult Swim reruns premiered. The timing was partly coincidence and partly smart business. The combination produced something extraordinary. The DVD sets sold 400,000 copies within the first month of release. Over time, the Season 1 and 2 package became the best-selling television DVD of all of 2003 and the second highest-selling television DVD in the entire history of the medium. At that point, behind only the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. Sales of all 3 seasons' DVD releases eventually surpassed 3 million copies. 3 million copies of DVDs for a show that no network wanted to touch. 3 million people who loved this thing enough to pay for it, to own it physically, to put it on a shelf. This was not a cult audience in the dismissive sense. This was an enormous audience that had simply never been aggregated in one place at one time in the way the original Fox scheduling chaos had prevented. Fox noticed. Of course they noticed. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice and sold the rights for next to nothing was now watching those same rights generate record-breaking DVD sales and cable ratings. That made their own current programming look modest. On May 20th, 2004, Fox made an announcement that had never been made in the history of American television. They were ordering 35 new episodes of a show they had previously canceled. Family Guy was coming back. This was the first time in television history that a canceled show had been resurrected based primarily on DVD sales performance. Family Guy did not just come back. It pioneered a new model for how audience loyalty could revive dead properties. MacFarlane, who had by this point spent 3 years not writing Family Guy, working on other projects, developing American Dad, rebuilding the writing staff that had scattered, came back. The writers returned, though not all the original ones. The production studio set back up, and on May 1, 2005, 3 years and roughly a week after the show's second cancellation, Family Guy's 4th season premiered on Fox. It drew 11.85 million viewers. The audience that had built during the Adult Swim years and the DVD era showed up and proved the theory right. They had been waiting. The show returned to what would become its permanent home on Sunday nights, as part of what Fox branded animation domination. The Sunday night animated lineup that at various points included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, American Dad, Bob's Burgers, and Family Guy itself. The brand name animation domination became one of those marketing phrases that actually stuck, that viewers adopted into their regular vocabulary, that described something real about Sunday evenings for a generation of television watchers. What nobody fully talked about at the time And what only became clear in retrospect was that the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that left in 2002. The 3-year gap had consequences. The writing staff was different. Some of the most important creative voices from the original run were not back. The production aesthetic had evolved. The animation studio handling the post-revival work was different from the studios that had handled the original seasons, and perhaps most significantly, the cultural moment that Family Guy was now part of was different from the one in which it had been born. In 1999, the show was new and surprising. In 2005, it was familiar, beloved, yes, but familiar. The expectations were different. The industry around it was different. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back, and the show's cutaway format proved perfectly suited to the clip culture that video sharing was about to create. Individual gags could be extracted, uploaded, shared, and watched by people who had never seen a full episode. Family Guy became one of the most clipped shows on the emerging internet, which was both a tremendous engine for new audience building and, in its own way, a pressure that shaped how the show was made going forward. The cancellations and the revival are not just interesting television history. They shape the show's identity in structural ways that ripple through every season that followed. The writing staff rotation that MacFarlane attributed to the instability of the show's first 3 seasons never fully stabilized. New voices kept coming in. The tone kept shifting incrementally. The characters who had been built with specific intentions in those first 3 seasons were now in the hands of people who had varying degrees of familiarity with those intentions. Some of them protected the original spirit faithfully. Some of them took the show in directions that would have been unrecognizable to the person who drew Larry and Steve in his kitchen at Rizd a decade earlier. But in the summer of 2005, none of that was visible. All that was visible was the return, the triumph, the vindication of the audience's loyalty, and the genuinely exciting prospect of new Family Guy being made again. The show was back. And for a while at least, that was enough. Section 5. The Writer's Room, where the jokes were born and who built them. The writer's room of a television show is one of those places that functions simultaneously as a workplace, a creative incubator, and a strange social ecosystem that shapes the show more than any audience member typically realizes. The people sitting around that table, pitching jokes, batting down ideas that don't work, building on fragments that do, arguing about character and tone and what is actually funny versus what they only think is funny, those are the people who determine what the show becomes over time. In the case of Family Guy, the history of the writer's room is in some ways the history of the show itself. The original writing team that MacFarlane assembled for the first 3 seasons included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. This group was important not just because of what they produced, but because they were present for the establishment of the show's tone. The specific blend of warmth and darkness, wit and absurdity that defined those first 3 seasons and that fans have spent 2 decades comparing every subsequent season against. When MacFarlane describes looking back on the early writing room, he emphasizes how much the consistency of that team mattered, how a group of people who know each other's creative instincts and trust each other's judgment produces work that a group of near strangers cannot replicate. The cancellations ended that. When the show came back in 2005, MacFarlane was clear that one of the most significant costs of being repeatedly pulled off the air was the constant restaffing of the writing team. Writers who leave for 3 years do not wait. They move on. They build careers elsewhere. When you call them back, some come, some do not. And the writers who fill the gaps are talented professionals, but they are not the same people with the same shared history and instincts that gave the original show its particular coherence. Ricky Blitt was one of the writers behind some of the most beloved early episodes, including early season gems that established the show's capacity for genuine heart underneath its surface chaos. Danny Smith, who stayed with the show through numerous seasons, became one of the most important figures in the room's long-term institutional memory. Gary Janetti went on to a highly successful career outside of Family Guy, including creating and writing the animated series Gallivant and developing his own celebrated social media presence as a humor writer. The dispersal of original talent into other projects was both a natural professional evolution and a real loss to the creative center of the show. Writers who joined in later seasons have been more candid, in interviews and in public commentary, about what the writers' room felt like in different eras. There are accounts of rooms where MacFarlane was deeply engaged, where his specific vision shaped every table discussion and every draft revision. There are accounts from the post-2011 era, after MacFarlane stepped back from active writing, where the room operated more autonomously, where the showrunners Rich Apple and Alec Sulkin were the primary creative authorities, and where MacFarlane's presence was felt through the characters' voices, literally in recording sessions, rather than in the development of the material. The Uyghur Strike of 2007 and 2008 hit the show during a period when it was already navigating the complexities of its post-revival identity. MacFarlane was a vocal supporter of the strike, walking picket lines, making his position publicly known. He had been through the experience of watching a previous labor dispute disrupt animated production, and he took the writers' concerns about digital distribution and DVD residuals seriously, but the strike still cost the show months of production, broke the rhythm of the season, and added stress to a creative process that was never not complicated. When Fox aired 3 completed Family Guy episodes during the strike without MacFarlane's permission, exercising their contractual right to broadcast completed material over the creator's objections, it created a strain between MacFarlane and the network that never fully healed. The relationship between a creator and the broadcast platform for their show is always in some tension, but having your own show aired against your explicit wishes during a labor action is the kind of thing that does not get forgotten in professional relationships. The 2023 WGA strike created another disruption. This one coming at a moment when MacFarlane's relationship with Fox was already complicated by his own publicly stated frustrations with the network's broader direction. MacFarlane joined the picket lines again, as did the show's showrunners. Production stopped. Episodes that had been in development were put on hold. The show eventually returned, but the interruptions accumulated over the years, and each one left some trace on the creative fabric of the production. Some of the most interesting stories from the writer's room involve how specific jokes were made and what they reveal about the creative process. The show's writers have described a method of pitching that is frankly chaotic. Every room meeting is a free-for-all, with people calling out ideas, cutting each other off, building on fragments, sometimes circling the same concept from 4 different directions before landing on something that works. The cutaway gag format, which is the show's signature comedic structure, was in many ways ideally suited to this kind of room culture. A cutaway gag is essentially a standalone joke that does not need to connect organically to a larger story. It needs to be funny, it needs to be set up by a simple phrase, and then it needs to deliver. A room full of people competing to pitch the funniest disconnected idea is exactly the right environment for producing these things in volume. The show's musical numbers, which became increasingly ambitious over the years, involved a different creative process. MacFarlane's genuine musical knowledge and his professional relationships with composers and music directors meant that musical episodes and musical sequences went through a development track that was distinct from the regular writing process. Walter Murphy, the show's longtime composer and musical director, became one of the most important creative collaborators in the show's history. Murphy and MacFarlane had a shared aesthetic sensibility rooted in big band jazz and Broadway orchestration, and the show's original songs reflected that sensibility in ways that consistently surprised viewers who expected animated comedy to settle for generic parody music. The show also developed a practice of bringing in guest writers or consultant writers for specific episodes, particularly parody episodes like the Star Wars trilogy parodies, which required extremely precise comedic reference work on top of an original story structure. The Blue Harvest episode, which parodied the original Star Wars film, required the writers to simultaneously maintain the emotional beats of the source material, subvert audience expectations about where the Family Guy version would go, and produce genuinely funny jokes that worked for viewers who knew Star Wars deeply and viewers who knew it only casually. Getting all three of those things right at once is a specific skill, and the episodes that pulled it off were widely celebrated. One behind-the-scenes fact about the production that rarely comes up in public discussion: the show maintains two versions of many episodes. Because Family Guy is produced for a network television broadcast and also for DVD and streaming release, certain scenes that were filmed or recorded for the full version are edited down or removed entirely for the broadcast cut. The DVD versions of episodes have always been uncensored, fouler language, scenes cut from broadcast, jokes that would not pass the network standards and practices review. These extended or alternate versions have developed their own following among fans who want to see what the show looked like before the broadcast filters were applied. The relationship between the show and its network standards and practices department is one of the defining creative tensions of Family Guy's entire run. The show has always pushed toward the edge of what Fox's broadcast standards allowed, and the negotiation over specific content, what stays, what gets cut, what gets altered, is a constant process. Some of the most famous censorship stories from the show's history involve moments where the standards process removed something the writers felt was essential to a joke's impact, or where the network made a specific demand that the writers considered artistically damaging. These negotiations never ended. They were built into the production cycle from the first season onward. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a show that was created by one person's very specific vision and then maintained by a constantly rotating group of other people, some of whom understood that vision deeply and some of whom brought their own different sensibilities. The shows that last as long as Family Guy has lasted almost always have this quality. They stop being the pure expression of one creator's intent and become collective enterprises, shaped by dozens of creative contributors over years and decades. What Family Guy became over its run is the product of all of those contributors, for better and for worse, in ways that MacFarlane himself has occasionally acknowledged with a candor that is rare in the entertainment industry. Section 6. Easter eggs, hidden jokes, and the art of hiding things in plain sight. One of the things that separates a show with genuine artistic care from one that is merely professionally produced is the presence of details that nobody required. Easter eggs, hidden references, background jokes, visual gags that reward close attention are the fingerprints of people who were genuinely engaged with what they were making. Family Guy, across its long run, has hidden an extraordinary number of these details inside its episodes. Some are quick and blink and you miss them. Some are layered and require pausing a DVD or frame advancing through streaming content to find. And some have been sitting in plain sight for years, only discovered recently because someone happened to look in the right place at the right moment. Take the sheet music above Lois's piano in the Griffin living room. It appears in dozens of episodes, visible in many shots of the family's main gathering space. For years, most viewers simply registered it as background decoration, the kind of detail that production design fills in to make a space look lived in and real. But the music on those pages is the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. Someone on the production team, a background artist or a prop designer, transcribed the notation for the show's opening theme and placed it there, readable by anyone who knew how to read music and thought to look closely enough. It serves no narrative function. It affects nothing. It is simply a gift to attentive viewers. Placed there because the person who put it there wanted to do something true. In the episode Love Thy Trophy, the Griffin family wins a trophy in a competition. In a brief moment that requires pausing to catch, we see Stewie playing with his building blocks in the corner of the scene. If you freeze the frame, the blocks spell out redrum. This is, of course, the word from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, the word that young Danny Torrance writes on the walls of the Overlook Hotel, and which is murder spelled backwards. The choice to put this specific reference into this specific character's hands, Stewie, who spends his days planning murder, is the kind of layered detail that shows the writers and production team were engaging with what they were making on multiple levels simultaneously. They knew who Stewie was. They knew what redrum meant. And they put those two things together and hid them in a corner of a frame. The newspaper prop joke is another classic. In an episode where the Griffin family sees their picture in a newspaper, the paper also contains a secondary headline. It reads, DVDs paused for headline joke. Millions disappointed. The joke is completely self-aware. It acknowledges that the gag exists for people who pause their DVDs to find exactly this kind of hidden content, and simultaneously suggests that those people are still going to be disappointed by what they find. It's a joke about the joke format itself, placed inside the joke format, which is the kind of infinite recursion that Family Guy's best hidden details achieve. In the Blue Harvest episode, the show's first Star Wars parody, there is a brief shot inside the cantina that contains a remarkable density of animated show crossover references. If you freeze on the right frame, you can spot Roger the Alien from American Dad, Bender from Futurama, Coach John McGuirk from Home Movies, and the Evil Monkey from Family Guys. Own running gag. This single background frame is a full catalog of animated shows with cultural connections to Family Guy. Some were on the same network, some were part of the same comedy ecosystem. Some were simply shows that the Family Guy production team admired or felt kinship with. Putting them all in the cantina together was an act of creative solidarity hidden in a single frame. The character who became known as Holden Caulfield in fan discussion is another example of the show's hidden narrative layers. In an episode where Peter is at a piano, pretending to play it without actually playing it, a random background character approaches him and begins berating him for being a fraud. This man then appears repeatedly throughout the same episode, surfacing in the background to continue the accusation. He is never named in the show. But fans, and reportedly some of the production staff, nicknamed him Holden Caulfield, after the famous protagonist of The Catcher in the Rye who is obsessed with identifying. Phonies. The character's entire function is to accuse Peter of being a phony. The literary reference is perfect. And it was never stated out loud in the show, just implied through the character's behavior. The running gag of the phrase, "What the hell?" appearing in almost every single episode of Family Guy is one of those discoveries that requires no equipment beyond paying close attention. One of the show's most thorough fan analysts documented the appearances of the phrase across hundreds of episodes and found it present in the vast majority of them. Said by different characters in different contexts for different reasons, but always there. It is the show's most universal linguistic tick, the one phrase that has become so deeply embedded in the show's DNA that it operates almost as a signature. Whether this was a deliberate decision by the original writing team or an emergent pattern that became a tradition is not entirely clear, but the consistency of it across more than 2 decades of episodes suggests that at some point it became intentional. The Family Guy / American Dad shared universe is acknowledged through dozens of small crossover details hidden in the backgrounds and margins of both shows. American Dad Stan Smith and his CIA handler Bullock appear briefly in the background of a scene in the two-part Family Guy episode where Stewie finally confronts Lois in a climactic showdown. Their appearance confirming that the Family Guy universe and the American Dad universe are geographically and canonically connected. In American Dad, Family Guy merchandise appears occasionally in the background, a Stewie toy, a Peter bumper sticker, acknowledging the sibling relationship between the two. Shows. This shared universe received its most explicit confirmation in the three-part Hurricane crossover event in 2011, where Peter, Stan Smith, and Cleveland Brown end up in the same location following a storm that affected all three of their fictional cities. The show's Star Wars parody trilogy, Blue Harvest, Something 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 Dark Side, and It's a Trap, contains arguably the highest density of hidden jokes and Easter eggs of any multi-episode project the show undertook. In the background of the Empire Strikes Back parody, there are multiple visual references to specific frames from the original film that only extremely close viewers of both the original Star Wars and the Family Guy version would catch. In one scene, a character is reading Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom, a joke that functions on two levels. The contemporary book feels absurd in the Star Wars context, and the specific choice of that particular book adds a layer for anyone familiar with its themes. The show's DVD commentary for all three Star Wars parody episodes is itself a treasure of behind-the-scenes information, with the cast and writers discussing individual jokes, their origins, and what didn't make the final cut. The Stewie Griffin The Untold Story DVD, which was released in 2005 as a standalone special and later divided into episodes for broadcast, contains a moment that most viewers might walk past without registering. When Brian and Stewie are at a yard sale in one scene, if you look at a table of items for sale, one of the items is a DVD copy of Stewie Griffin The Untold Story, the very thing you were watching. The show is acknowledging its own existence as a product inside the frame of the product itself. This kind of layered self-reference is easy to dismiss as a quirky trick, but it actually reflects a genuine ongoing conversation between the show and its most engaged viewers, tradition of acknowledging that everyone knows this is a television show. One of the most technically impressive hidden Easter eggs involves the show's intro. The famous opening sequence where the Griffins perform a musical number that ends with the family sitting down to watch television contains small visual details that have changed across different seasons, reflecting events from the show's history. Attentive viewers have cataloged these changes and documented how specific background elements in the opening sequence have been updated to reflect things that happened in the most recent season, or to acknowledge changes in the cast, or to reference upcoming storylines. The opening sequence is not static. It is a living piece of animation that has been quietly revised dozens of times, while most viewers absorbed it as the same familiar sequence. The show's most famous running gag, the giant chicken fight, is itself a kind of elaborate Easter egg with each new installment. These sequences, where Peter gets into enormous city-destroying physical confrontations with a giant anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie, appear at irregular intervals. Throughout the show's run, each one is longer, more elaborate, and more destructive than the last. The gag began as a one-off joke but became a recurring spectacle. The production team apparently treats each new chicken fight as an opportunity to create the most technically ambitious physical comedy sequence the show has ever done. Every new fight is a hidden conversation with everyone who has seen all the previous fights. A challenge to outdo what came before. As of the most recent seasons, the chicken fight sequences have become genuinely elaborate action film parodies, with the production values of a miniature action movie packed inside an animated comedy episode. Section 7. The Controversies. Banned, censored, and the shows that made countries nervous. Family Guy has never been a show that played it safe with sensitive material. From its very first episode, it pushed into territory that other network animated shows avoided, testing what Fox's broadcast standards would allow, what special interest groups would tolerate, and what the American public's genuine taste for transgressive humor actually was. The result, over more than 2 decades, has been one of the most documented records of television controversy in the history of the medium. A running catalog of complaints. Censorship decisions, legal actions, international bans, and genuine cultural confrontations that tells you as much about American society as it does about any single television show. The Parents Television Council, a conservative advocacy organization focused on broadcast content, became Family Guy's most consistent institutional critic from essentially the first season forward. The PTC placed Family Guy on its worst TV show of the week list on no fewer than 40 separate occasions over the years. They launched letter-writing campaigns to pressure Fox advertisers, asking companies like Wrigley and Burger King to stop running commercials during Family Guy episodes because their products appealed to children, and the show's content was not appropriate for children. They filed formal complaints with the Federal Communications Commission regarding specific episodes, citing violations of broadcast decency standards. The FCC received the PTC's complaints and reviewed them, consistently ruling in Family Guy's favor on technical grounds. The Commission's standard for broadcast indecency requires content to be patently offensive in a way that lacks redemptive value. The FCC, reviewing specific episodes, repeatedly found that while the content was mature and in some cases deliberately provocative, it did not cross the legal threshold for indecency in ways that would justify regulatory action. The PTC's campaign was consistent but largely unsuccessful in its stated goals. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein represents one of the most interesting censorship stories in the show's history. The episode, which appeared at the end of the 3rd season production run, featured Peter wishing for a Jewish person to help him manage his finances and then trying to have Chris converted to Judaism. Fox held the episode from broadcast, concerned that the episode might be perceived as promoting anti-Semitic stereotypes. The episode sat unaired for over 3 years. Adult Swim, operating under different broadcast restrictions than Fox's primetime schedule, eventually aired it in November 2003. Fox finally broadcast it in 2004, more than 2 years after it was produced. The episode had in the meantime become legendary precisely because it had been suppressed, generating more interest in it than it might have received in normal broadcast rotation. Partial Terms of Endearment is the other famous banned episode, and unlike the Weinstein episode, it has never aired on American broadcast television as of the time of writing. The episode, produced for Season 8, featured Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for a college friend. When the friend and her husband die in a car accident, Lois must decide whether to carry the pregnancy to term or terminate it. The episode deals directly with abortion, including the word itself multiple times, which Seth MacFarlane noted was unusual for American broadcast television, where abortion-related content is often carefully managed. Fox declined to air it and also reportedly communicated to Adult Swim that they preferred Adult Swim not air it either. BBC Three in the United Kingdom broadcast it in June 2010. It appeared on the Season 8 DVD set in the United States, making it accessible to American viewers but never part of a broadcast. As of 2024, it is not available on Hulu or Disney Plus in the United States. The episode Turban Cowboy created a different kind of controversy, one driven by timing rather than content alone. The episode, which aired in March 2013, contained a cutaway gag depicting Peter driving a vehicle through the Boston Marathon, killing runners. On its own, this was dark humor in the style the show had practiced for years. But on April 15, 2013, roughly a month after the episode's broadcast, bombs were detonated near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The episode was immediately pulled from rebroadcast and from Fox's online streaming platforms. It took until September 2022 for the episode to reappear on Hulu. This episode represents one of those painful moments where comedy, even comedy that was made years before the event it uncomfortably echoed, becomes genuinely difficult to. Separate from real-world tragedy, the show's international ban history is extensive and reflects the cultural tensions between American media's understanding of acceptable satire and the values of other societies. Egypt banned Family Guy due to what officials described as moral censorship and religious reasons. The show's treatment of religious figures and religious institutions was fundamentally incompatible with Egyptian broadcast standards. Russia removed the show from broadcast because it was deemed too immoral for Russian television audiences. Iran's objections were specifically focused on the show's portrayal of gay characters, in a political context where homosexuality carries legal penalties. A show that featured gay characters in sympathetic or comedic roles was politically problematic. South Korea, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa, Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines have all at various points restricted or banned Family Guy broadcasts on their own. National networks. The reasons vary across these countries. Some cite indecency standards, some cite religious considerations, some cite political content. But the pattern is consistent. American. Animated comedy that operates within American cultural norms about what is acceptable content does not necessarily operate within the norms of other societies. Venezuela's decision to ban the show focused on a specific episode, the Season 7 episode 420, in which Brian campaigns to legalize marijuana in the Griffins' hometown. Venezuela's justice minister at the time cited the episode as promoting drug use and a broader American cultural agenda around narcotics. Cable stations in Venezuela were warned they would face fines if they continued to air the episode. It was a specific, documented government response to the content of a single episode of an American animated television show, and it represents one of the stranger chapters in the show's international history. The lawsuit filed by Born Co. music publishers in October 2007 is one of the more significant legal stories from the show's history. Born Co. holds the copyright on When You Wish Upon a Star, the famous song from the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio. In the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the show included a parody song called I Need a Jew that was written to a melody Born Co. claimed closely resembled their copyrighted music. The lawsuit alleged that the parody paired what they described as a thinly veiled copy of their music with anti-Semitic lyrics. Legal arguments over fair use and parody protection were extensive. The case was eventually dismissed on First Amendment grounds, with the court finding that the parody was protected expression. The case became a significant reference point in legal discussions about the boundaries of fair use protection for musical parody in animated comedy. The South Park feud deserves its own dedicated discussion here, because it represents one of the more unusual institutional critiques a television show has ever received from a competing television show. South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone aired a 2-part episode in 2006 called Cartoon Wars, in which they directly attacked Family Guy's writing methodology. The episode depicted Family Guy's jokes as being produced by a tank of manatees who randomly pushed idea balls together, suggesting that the show's humor was genuinely random. and required no actual craft or intelligence to produce. The critique was blunt, direct, and not hidden behind any kind of protective irony. Parker and Stone have spoken publicly about their lack of respect for Family Guy's writing, and MacFarlane has responded to this at various points over the years. What makes the feud notable beyond the entertainment industry gossip of it is that the Cartoon Wars episodes were reportedly received with significant appreciation by writers on several other shows, including The Simpsons and King of the Hill, who apparently reached out to Parker and Stone to express gratitude for articulating something they had. Themselves been thinking but not saying publicly. Whether or not Parker and Stone's specific critique of Family Guy's writing is fair is a matter of genuine creative debate. What is undeniable is that it happened publicly, generated enormous discussion, and contributed to an ongoing conversation about what Family Guy was and what kind of comedy it was practicing. The PTC conflict, the international bans, the Turban Cowboy controversy, the legal actions, the South Park feud, these are not isolated incidents. They are part of a continuous pattern that reflects a show that was always, by design, operating in contested territory. MacFarlane built Family Guy to push against limits. The controversies are not a side effect of that ambition. They are a direct result of it, and in many ways they are part of the show's identity. Section 8. The music. Why Family Guy sings, A&D why it matters. There are animated comedy shows that include music, and then there is Family Guy, which treats music as a genuine creative medium and has produced more original songs than some professional songwriting careers. The musical dimension of the show is not incidental. It is structural. It is part of MacFarlane's gnaw as a creative person, rooted in a childhood spent listening to Broadway cast albums, big band records, and the orchestral pop music of the 1940s and 1950s. The show's relationship to music reflects its creator's genuine love of it, and that authenticity comes through in the quality of what gets produced. MacFarlane fought for the show's theme song against Fox network pressure. The network, following a broader television industry trend toward shorter or absent theme songs, encouraged him not to include a full opening musical number. MacFarlane resisted. He wanted a proper theme. The kind of musical opening that gave a show ceremony and identity, that told viewers something about what kind of thing they were sitting down to watch. The eventual theme. The one that opens every episode with the Griffins in a musical sequence accompanied by the Griffin family dog and featuring orchestration that deliberately evokes Broadway show tunes, is both a parody of the musical opening and a genuine example of one. It functions simultaneously as satire and as the real thing. Walter Murphy is the name that most Family Guy viewers do not know, but that is central to understanding the show's musical identity. Murphy is the show's composer and musical director, and his background is specifically in big band jazz and orchestral pop, exactly the aesthetic MacFarlane loved from childhood. The two of them have a musical partnership that runs through the entire show, and Murphy's ability to write quickly, across enormous stylistic range, on deadline, gave the show the capacity to produce original songs and musical sequences in quantities and at a quality level that most animated shows would not attempt. Murphy's work is the foundation under everything musical in Family Guy, and his contributions to the show represent one of the most significant and underappreciated achievements in animated television music. The original songs that Family Guy has produced over its run cover an extraordinary range of genres, styles, and comedic registers. The vasectomy song, where Peter and friends harmonize about Peter avoiding a vasectomy, is a perfect parody of barbershop quartet music. I've Got a Little List from the Gilbert and Sullivan tradition appears in episodes that lean into MacFarlane's theatrical knowledge. Road to Rhode Island, the song from the first Brian and Stewie road trip episode, was written as a genuine mid-century show tune, a piece of music that would not have been out of place in a 1950s Broadway production, performed by a talking dog and an evil baby. The specific joke of that? These two absurd characters suddenly performing something genuinely musically accomplished is only available because the music was genuinely good. MacFarlane's own singing career runs parallel to and through the show in ways that are worth understanding separately from the show itself. After years of singing in character voices for the show, Peter, Stewie, Quagmire, and others all have their own musical voices. Each distinct, MacFarlane decided to record an album as himself in his own voice, singing the music he had loved since childhood. Music is Better Than Words came out in 2011 and was Grammy nominated. It featured MacFarlane singing big band standards and classic American songbook material, recorded with a live orchestra at studios including Abbey Road in London. The vocal coaches who prepared him for the album included Lee and Sally Sweetland, who at various points had worked with Barbra Streisand and Frank Sinatra. MacFarlane recorded many of the vocal tracks on a microphone that Sinatra himself had used. This is not a side story about celebrity hobby albums. MacFarlane is a genuinely skilled singer who studied seriously and produced work that received real critical recognition in the music world, separate from his television career. The albums he has released since Music is Better Than Words, including Holiday for Swing in 2014, No One Ever Tells You in 2015, In Full Swing in 2017, Once in a While in 2019, and subsequent records represent a sustained engagement with mid-century popular music that has continued regardless of the demands of his television work. In June 2025, he released Lush Life: The Lost Sinatra Arrangements, an album built around original arrangements that Nelson Riddle, Billy May, and Don Costa had created for Frank Sinatra, but that had never been produced. MacFarlane found these arrangements in Sinatra's personal music library and recorded them with conductor John Wilson. This is the background against which Family Guy's musical ambitions have always operated. The man writing these shows has genuine musical knowledge and genuine musical ambition, and it shows in what the show attempts. The musical episodes that devote large portions of their runtime to original songs rather than dialogue-driven comedy, work precisely because the people making them understand music, not just comedy. Road to the North Pole contains original Christmas songs that are genuinely charming as Christmas music, not just as parody. The I Dream of Jesus episode, built around a Buddy Holly song, contains material that reflects real knowledge of 1950s rock and roll and its relationship to religious themes. These are not approximations of musical knowledge. They are the real thing deployed in comedic contexts. The show also has a long history of using existing music in ways that generate their own comedy. The decision to feature extended Conway Twitty performances running the country singer's actual recordings without interruption or commentary in the middle of episodes is perhaps the most discussed example. This choice was widely interpreted as a lazy filler device, a way to run out episode time without writing more comedy. This interpretation is not entirely wrong. But there is also an argument that the Conway Twitty gag is a very specific comedy choice about audience patience, commitment, and the nature of a television show's implicit contract with its viewers. When the joke works, and the first time it appeared, it genuinely surprised and confounded viewers in a way that could be read as a form of avant-garde comedy, it works because it violates every expectation simultaneously. When it stopped working, the repeat appearances became the very thing critics accused them of being. The difference between those two readings is everything. The musical dimension of Family Guy's legacy is under-discussed in the broader conversation about the show's significance. When people talk about what Family Guy changed in television, they typically talk about the cutaway gag format, about the show's influence on adult animation more broadly, about its ratings history, the musical contribution, the years of original songs, the sophisticated engagement with American popular music history, the training of mainstream audiences to expect and enjoy musical sequences in adult animation is a genuine and lasting part of what the show created. Section 9. The MacFarlane Universe. Spin-offs, crossovers, and the Animated Empire. By 2005, Seth MacFarlane had built something unusual in American television. A genuine, animated franchise, not just one successful show, but the nucleus of what would become a shared fictional universe spanning multiple series, interconnected by geography, character, and creative. Sensibility. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just months before Family Guy's return for its fourth season, and for the first time, MacFarlane's creative world expanded beyond. The Griffins. The Cleveland show followed in 2009, creating a third spoke on the wheel. Together, these three shows inhabited the same universe, characters crossing between them, fictional towns occupying the same map, and the shared production infrastructure at 20th Television Animation, giving them a visual coherence that made the crossovers feel natural rather than forced. American Dad was co-created by MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show centered on Stan Smith, a CIA agent, patriotic to the point of dysfunction. Conservative in ways that the show examined with a combination of mockery and surprising affection. And his family in Langley Falls, Virginia. The Smith family consisted of Stan's wife, Francine, their college-age daughter, Haley, their teenage son, Steve, a space alien named Roger who lived in the attic, and a goldfish named Klaus who contained the transplanted brain of an East German Olympic ski jumper. The premise was self-evidently absurd, and it embraced that absurdity from the beginning in a way that Family Guy did not always fully commit to in its early seasons. What makes American Dad significant in the context of the MacFarlane universe is what it did differently. Unlike Family Guy, American Dad was built without the cutaway gag format. The stories were linear. Each episode had a beginning, a middle, and an end that connected continuously. The characters had to be funny within the constraints of the story, not as jumping-off points for random gags. This structural difference forced the American Dad writing staff to develop storytelling muscles that Family Guy's format did not require in the same way. The result, as the seasons accumulated, was a show that many fans of both programs came to regard as the more consistently satisfying of the two. The character of Roger the Alien became one of the most beloved characters in the MacFarlane universe across any of his shows. Roger's defining ability, he could adopt completely different personas, essentially becoming entirely different characters with different names, different backgrounds. Different speech patterns, different physical appearances, gave the show an inexhaustible source of comedic material. Every episode that featured Roger in a new disguise was in some sense a new character entirely, and the voice work and writing required to populate those disguises season after season demanded genuine creative effort. Roger, through this mechanism, could be a suburban mother, a shady car dealer, a French fashion designer, a retired linebacker, an aging Vegas performer, and a teenage girl in different episodes. Each persona more specific and more committed than the last. The Cleveland show launched in 2009 with Cleveland Brown, who had been one of the original Spooner Street neighbors since the show's first season, moving away from the Griffins to start a new life with his new wife Donna in Stool Bend, Virginia. The spin-off received mixed reviews from critics, with some finding Cleveland too subdued a character to carry his own show, and others finding the new ensemble, including Roger's equivalents in a different format, interesting and undervalued. The show ran for 4 seasons, 88 episodes total, before Fox canceled it in 2013. Cleveland and Donna then returned to the Family Guy universe proper, moving back onto Spooner Street across from the Griffins, where they have remained as recurring characters. The three-show crossover event called Night of the Hurricane in 2011 was one of the most ambitious programming events in Fox's animation domination history. The crossover was conceived as a single storm, affecting all three shows' locations simultaneously. A hurricane moving up the eastern seaboard from Stool Bend through the Griffins' Rhode Island hometown all the way to Langley Falls in Virginia. Each show handled the same storm in its own episode, with its own characters and its own narrative, and at the end of the American Dad episode, the three families ended up in proximity to each other. Peter Griffin, Stan Smith, and Cleveland Brown in the same physical space, acknowledging each other's existence in the same fictional universe. This had been hinted at and quietly confirmed in background details for years. The Hurricane crossover made it explicit and permanent. The crossover with The Simpsons, titled The Simpsons Guy and airing on September 28, 2014, was a more unusual event, given that The Simpsons and Family Guy are not part of the same shared fictional universe in the way that Family Guy, American Dad, and The Cleveland Show are. The Simpsons is its own entirely separate creative world, made by entirely different people, with its own institutional history and its own distinct aesthetic. Bringing the Griffins and The Simpsons together required both shows to agree to a kind of comedic negotiation about what each family represented and how they would interact. The resulting episode sent the Griffin family to Springfield after their car was stolen. The central conflict, whether Pawtucket Patriot Ale was a copy of Duff Beer, allowed the episode to engage directly with the relationship between the two shows and the long-running discussion in the animation community about whether Family Guy owed a debt to The Simpsons. The fight between Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin, which the episode framed as a parody of Family Guy's own giant chicken fights while Homer defended his Emmy wins, was a piece of self-aware comedy that worked precisely because everyone watching understood the meta-context. Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, and Hank Azaria all appeared voicing their Simpsons characters, which required a level of institutional cooperation between two competing shows that was genuinely unusual. The episode also featured a brief appearance by Bob Belcher from Bob's Burgers, Roger from American Dad, and Fred Flintstone, essentially a catalog of animated shows in the Fox universe, each appearing long enough to acknowledge their existence and then disappearing. It was a crossover that operated as a love letter to the entire Fox animated canon while simultaneously being a comedy episode about two specific families who had too much in common for comfort. The MacFarlane universe also expanded into live action through films and television. The Ted franchise began in 2012 with MacFarlane directing and starring in a film about a man whose childhood teddy bear came to life and grew up to be a crude, dissolute adult. Bear. Ted earned over $500 million worldwide, a genuinely staggering number for an R-rated comedy about a talking stuffed animal. Ted 2 followed in 2015, a live-action prequel series for Peacock launched in 2024, expanding the franchise into a different medium while maintaining the core concept. A Million Ways to Die in the West was a 2014 Western comedy parody that MacFarlane wrote, directed, produced, and starred in alongside Charlize Theron, Liam Neeson, Neil Patrick Harris, and Sarah Silverman. The Orville, which premiered on Fox in 2017 and moved to Hulu for subsequent seasons, represented MacFarlane's most ambitious departure from animated comedy. The show is a science fiction series set aboard a mid-level spacecraft in the 25th century, exploring moral and social questions through the framework of Star Trek. Adjacent storytelling while also containing genuine humor and character comedy. MacFarlane serves as creator, executive producer, and star. The show's first season was received somewhat uncertainly. It occupied an unusual middle ground between parody and genuine science fiction drama, but subsequent seasons developed a following that is passionate and deeply engaged. Many viewers of The Orville who are also Family Guy fans have described it as the work that most clearly represents MacFarlane's full creative range. The project where his genuine values and genuine intellectual interests are most visible. The announcement in March 2026 that Fox had ordered a Stewie spin-off series titled simply Stewie represented the newest expansion of the MacFarlane universe. Details were limited at announcement, but the prospect of a full series built around Stewie Griffin's character opened up creative possibilities that Family Guy's ensemble format had never fully explored. The universe MacFarlane built from a thesis film in 1995 to a multi-show, multi-film, multi-album enterprise now spans live action and animation, network and streaming, comedy, and drama, film and television. It is one of the most extensive creative empires built by a single person in the history of American entertainment, and its anchor, the thing everything else grew from, is a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town, a talking dog, and an evil baby with a football-shaped head. Section 10. The ratings and the business. Who watches and why it keeps going. Numbers tell part of the story. They tell the most honest part in some ways, because they are not subject to interpretation in the way critical assessments are. And they do not reflect the enthusiasm of dedicated fans in the way social media presence does. Numbers tell you who is watching, in what quantities, at what times. And the ratings history of Family Guy is a document of extraordinary rise, significant decline, and persistent survival that reveals as much about the television industry's economics as it does about any single show. The premier audience of 22 million viewers on January 31st, 1999, established an immediate ceiling that the show would spend the rest of its existence measuring itself against and coming up short. That number was inflated by the Super Bowl lead-in. Any show airing after the Super Bowl receives an audience it has not earned through its own merits, simply because the viewers are already there. But even accounting for that, a first-season average of approximately 12.8 million households was genuinely strong for an untested new property on a broadcast network. The scheduling chaos that contributed to the first two cancellations, Thursday against Frasier, Tuesday against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and ongoing instability that prevented the show from building consistent audience habits, produced ratings that did not reflect the show's actual appeal. This is an important distinction that was eventually proved correct by the Adult Swim performance. The show had an audience. That audience could not find it under the conditions Fox created. The Season 4 return in 2005 opened to 11.85 million viewers, and for several years following the revival, Family Guy maintained a presence in the 8 to 10 million viewer range on Sunday nights, which for an animated comedy in the mid-2000s was a legitimate success. The show was part of animation domination's identity. It was generating cultural conversation. It was producing viral moments in the early YouTube era, and from a pure business standpoint, it was doing what it needed to do. The gradual decline in ratings across the subsequent decade was not sudden or dramatic at any single moment. It was the kind of slow erosion that is easy to explain away season by season. The streaming environment was changing television viewing habits broadly. The competition landscape was shifting. The Sunday night slot was more contested. All of these explanations were true. None of them was the whole story. By season 13, airing from 2014 to 2015, the average viewership had dropped to approximately 5.86 million. By season 20, the number had fallen to 1.31 million, with a 0.45 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers value most. By season 23, the show was averaging roughly 723,000 viewers per episode, less than 750,000 people for a new episode of one of Fox's most historically significant series. The decision in 2023 to move Family Guy from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights was widely understood within the television industry as a demotion. Sunday night animation had been Family Guy's home for most of its run. The animation domination block had been built around it. Moving to Wednesday, a weeknight, a lower profile slot, a night with different audience expectations, was the network acknowledging something it had previously been reluctant. To state explicitly, Family Guy was no longer a centerpiece of the schedule. It was a workable midweek offering. And yet the show continues. It continues because the business of Family Guy extends far beyond first-run viewership numbers. Animated shows are produced at a fraction of the cost of live-action dramas or comedies. No expensive sets. No large on-screen casts with multi-million-dollar contracts. The voice actors record their sessions and the animation is produced at studios that have the workflow down to extreme efficiency after more than 2 decades. The per-episode cost of producing Family Guy is vastly lower than the per-episode cost of producing virtually any comparable live-action program. And the back catalog is enormously valuable. Family Guy airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It streams on Hulu in the United States, contributing to Hulu's subscription retention numbers. Disney Plus carries the show internationally through the Star platform. The merchandise ecosystem, t-shirts, toys, video games, a pinball machine manufactured by Stern Pinball in 2007, collectible figures, mobile games, board games, generates revenue that does not show up in the Nielsen ratings but shows up on someone's balance sheet. Family Guy Back to the Multiverse, the video game released in 2012, and the earlier Family Guy video game from 2006, both sold into a market of fans who wanted to inhabit the show's world in a format beyond watching. The pinball machine that Stern produced featured MacFarlane recording exclusive new audio and character content that was created specifically for the machine rather than repurposed from existing episodes. These are the kind of licensing decisions that generate revenue quietly over years. The mega deal, announced in April 2025, renewing Family Guy for 4 more seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television season and coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary, was described in industry coverage as primarily driven by the show's streaming and licensing value rather than its first-run broadcast performance. Disney, which now owns Fox through the 2019 acquisition, holds Family Guy as part of an enormous animated content library that generates revenue across multiple platforms and markets. A show with more than 400 episodes is a streaming platform's dream. It fuels hours of content recommendation queue. It keeps subscribers engaged. It surfaces an algorithm-driven discovery for viewers who never watched it during its original broadcast run. MacFarlane's own position in relation to the show and the network became increasingly complicated as the years passed. His 2020 deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years, moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, away from Fox and toward the Comcast family of networks and platforms. His newer projects, including the Orville and the TED series, were made for platforms outside the Fox ecosystem. His publicly stated frustration with Fox News, his description of his relationship with Fox as resembling a failing marriage, his explicit wish that Family Guy were on any other network. All of this created a strange situation where the creator of one of a network's most historically significant programs was publicly indicating he did not want to be there. But the contracts held. The voice work continued. The checks cleared. And Family Guy kept getting made and kept getting watched by enough people to justify its continuation on purely economic terms. Whether this is a tragedy or simply the nature of a commercial art form operating within institutional constraints is a philosophical question rather than a factual one. The numbers are clear. The show exists because it is profitable, and it will continue to exist for the same reason. Section 11. Legacy, influence, And what Family Guy actually changed. It is possible to simultaneously recognize a show's flaws and acknowledge its genuine significance. These are not contradictory positions. Family Guy's legacy is not the story of a perfect artistic achievement. It is the story of a genuinely original creative vision that changed the language of animated television comedy and influenced a generation of creators who grew up watching it, regardless of what they eventually thought of its later seasons. The most direct and most significant influence Family Guy had on American television was the validation of adult-oriented animation as a viable, commercially sustainable genre on network broadcast television. The Simpsons had established that animated comedy could reach adult audiences and achieve mainstream cultural prominence, but The Simpsons operated within a relatively safe, comedic register, darkly satirical at its best, but never transgressive in the way Family Guy was. Family Guy demonstrated that there was an audience for animated comedy that was aggressively adult, that was willing to go places broadcast television had not previously gone in. The animation format, and that could generate enough sustained viewership to justify network investment. The success of Family Guy opened a space that was subsequently occupied by dozens of shows that would not have been made, or would not have been made in the same way, without Family Guy's having been first. American Dad, which MacFarlane made himself, represents the most direct lineage, but the explosion of adult animated comedy on network and cable television in the 2000s and 2010s, shows like Bob's Burgers, Archer, BoJack Horseman, Rick and Morty, Big Mouth, and many others, exists in a cultural context that Family Guy helped create. These shows were greenlit by network executives and platform programmers who had data proving that adult animated comedy could find large, passionate, commercially valuable audiences. That data came in large part from Family Guy. The cutaway gag format, which Family Guy popularized to a degree that no previous show had achieved, has become a ubiquitous feature of internet humor culture far beyond the show itself. The basic structure. It's just like that time when this is worse than when. This reminds me of, followed by a disconnected comedic image, is now a structural template that has been replicated across social media, short-form video, meme culture, and internet comedy in general. YouTube compilations of Family Guy cutaway gags have accumulated billions of views. TikTok videos built on the same structural logic, presenting a premise and then cutting to an unexpected image that subverts or reframes it, owe something, however indirectly, to the format that Family Guy made central to its identity. The show's influence on how television comedy thinks about pop culture references is significant. Family Guy's specific approach to referencing cultural material, not building jokes that require knowledge of the reference to work, but rather using the reference itself as the joke, presenting cultural material as punchline rather than context, became enormously influential on a generation of writers and creators. This approach has been criticized by the South Park episode and many critics as lazy. It has also been enormously effective at connecting with audiences who feel recognized by the references, who feel that the show shares their cultural vocabulary. The show's revival, the specific story of cancellation, Adult Swim reruns, DVD sales, and resurrection, became a template that the industry and fans have attempted to replicate ever since. When Futurama was brought back after cancellation based on strong DVD sales and Adult Swim performance, it was following the pattern Family Guy had established. When other canceled shows have been revived by streaming services based on fan campaign energy and catalog performance data, the discourse around those revivals always references Family Guy as the pioneering example. Family Guy was the first, and the specifics of how it happened, fan loyalty expressed through DVD purchasing, cult viewership on late-night cable, have influenced how the industry thinks about canceled shows ever since. The Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009 was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable moments in television award history. No animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 5 decades earlier. Not The Simpsons, not South Park, not King of the Hill. Family Guy. The nomination acknowledged something real. At its peak, Family Guy was operating at a level of comedic ambition and execution that deserved recognition alongside live action. Comedies, regardless of the medium. The nomination also sparked a genuine conversation in the industry about whether animated comedies had been systematically under-recognized by award bodies relative to their live-action counterparts. A conversation that had consequences for how the Emmys subsequently classified and considered animated work. TV Guide's 2013 ranking of Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time placed it in company with some of the most significant animated shows in the history of the medium. The ranking reflected a specific moment in the show's history. It had not yet crossed into the territory that critics and fans would later describe as its most problematic, period, but it also reflected something durable about the show's first decade of existence and the genuine innovation it represented. The international reach of Family Guy is another dimension of its legacy that is easy to overlook from within the United States. The show aired in over 50 countries at various points in its run. Despite the bans and restrictions discussed in an earlier section, it generated genuine fandom in the United Kingdom, where it aired on BBC Three, Channel 4, and Fox UK, in Australia, Canada, Brazil, Germany, and across Europe. The specific humor, the pop culture references, the Griffin family dynamic, all of it traveled in ways that were not entirely predictable given how deeply embedded in American cultural specifics the show sometimes was. The universality of the family comedy format, the universal recognition of the dysfunctional parent and the put-upon teenager and the weird baby, translated even when specific. Jokes required cultural decoding. The show's presence in internet culture deserves a separate and honest acknowledgement. Family Guy's clips, memes, and GIFs are among the most widely circulated pieces of animated internet content in history. The format of the show, short self-contained funny moments that can be extracted from their narrative context without losing their impact, made it ideally suited to the clip culture that developed alongside YouTube and later spread to every video sharing and social media platform. A teenager watching a Family Guy clip compilation in 2015 who had never seen a full episode was still being influenced by the show's comedy style, its timing, its specific kind of dark humor. That influence, that ambient cultural presence, is a legacy dimension that does not show up in ratings numbers but is absolutely real. Section 12. The strange, the obscure, and the barely believable behind-the-scenes facts you have probably never heard. The story of Family Guy contains hundreds of specific facts that live in the margins, things that happened during production, connections that turned out to be coincidences or were discovered only years later, moments of creative decision-making that illuminated entire character trajectories, choices made in the writer's room that were accidents hardened into tradition. These facts do not fit neatly into any single narrative thread. They are their own category of knowledge, the kind of things you learn about a show when you have spent years paying attention to it. And they are worth knowing. Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on September 11, 2001. This is a documented fact, confirmed by MacFarlane himself in multiple interviews. He had been attending a meeting in Boston and was scheduled to fly from Boston's Logan International Airport back to Los Angeles that morning. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time. The agent told him the flight left at 8:15 in the morning when the actual departure was 7:45. MacFarlane also had what he described as a particularly rough hangover from the night before, which made him run even later than he otherwise would have. He arrived at the gate approximately 10 minutes after it had closed. Flight 11 departed without him and was hijacked 45 minutes later, eventually being flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m., killing all 92 people. Aboard. MacFarlane has discussed this moment in interviews with a characteristic combination of directness and philosophical calm. He has described sitting in the airport lounge after missing the flight, booking a later connection, falling asleep waiting, and waking up to a television showing the footage of the tower burning. He has said that the experience has informed his atheism, that he does not interpret his survival as evidence of divine intervention, but rather as evidence that random events determine outcomes, which is both more honest and more frightening than the comfort of believing something protected him specifically. He has also said that he lives exactly as he would have lived without that experience, which is either very brave or very human, or both. The fact that MacFarlane was on the passenger manifest for Flight 11 was reported in the weeks following the attacks, and he has confirmed it whenever asked. It places him in a very small group of people who were scheduled to be on one of the 4 hijacked planes and survived because of circumstances outside their control. Here is another one. The character of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was pregnant for 116 episodes across approximately 7 seasons of television. This began as either a continuity error that nobody caught or a deliberate choice to leave the situation unresolved, and it accumulated over so many episodes that it became one. Of those things the show acknowledged as a running gag after the fact. When Bonnie finally gave birth to baby Susie in the Season 7 episode We Love You, Conrad, fans who had been watching since the first season had lived through a fictional pregnancy that lasted approximately 7 years of real time. Baby Susie, once born, was voiced by none other than Patrick Stewart, the actor best known for playing Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek The Next Generation, giving Bonnie's newborn baby daughter one of the most distinguished and incongruous voices in the history of animated television. The character of Mayor Adam West was almost not voiced by Adam West. Early in the show's development, there was discussion about casting someone else in the role. The specific vocal quality that the character needed was the question, and it was. Not immediately certain that the actual Adam West would be available or interested. MacFarlane, who had developed a genuine admiration for West's work and had met him through the Hanna-Barbera connection when he was working on Johnny Bravo, West appeared in. That show eventually arranged for West to audition for the role. West's deadpan delivery of completely absurd material was so precisely right that the question resolved itself. West got the part and kept it for the rest of his life. MacFarlane met Adam West while working on Johnny Bravo, and West also appears in the John Bravo cast. He met Jack Sheldon of Schoolhouse Rock fame in the same period. These early connections through the Cartoon Network world gave MacFarlane a Rolodex of voice actors and performers that would prove enormously useful when building the guest cast. For Family Guy in the years ahead, the Gumble 2 Gumble joke appearing in a cutaway in one of the later seasons references what MacFarlane has confirmed is a real rejected television pitch. Before Fox greenlit Family Guy, MacFarlane had pitched another show concept to the network. They passed on it. When Family Guy became successful, MacFarlane quietly included the name of that rejected pitch in a cutaway gag, turning his own professional rejection into a buried joke that doubled as a gentle dig at the network that passed on his earlier idea. One of the most technically interesting facts about the show's production involves the recording setup. Family Guy records its main cast together in the same booth at the same time, which, as noted earlier, is relatively unusual in animated production. What makes this technically complex is that MacFarlane is simultaneously voicing 4 of the 6 principal characters. When a scene requires Peter and Brian to have a conversation, MacFarlane is in a sense having a conversation with himself across two different characters. When Stewie and Quagmire share a scene, same situation. The cast has described recording sessions as genuinely energetic and funny events, people making each other laugh, building off each other's performances, the energy of a live performance informing a medium that is technically entirely about the recorded voice. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the beginning, has spoken in interviews about the experience of working within this ensemble setup. She has described recording sessions where something unexpected happens and everybody in the booth gets laughing, and how that energy sometimes finds its way into the final. Recorded take in ways that technical editing could not replicate. The organic messiness of group recording, when it works, produces a warmth in the finished product that isolated booth recordings rarely achieve. The show developed a version of Stewie's voice that most viewers have heard without ever having encountered the original. In the earliest concept stages of the character, before MacFarlane had fully committed to the Rex Harrison via British villain approach, Stewie's voice was something different and less defined. The specific alignment between the character's visual design, the football-shaped head, the yellow shirt, the diaper, and the imperious theatrical British accent was not inevitable. It was a creative decision that could have gone another way. The version of Stewie that actually exists is one of multiple possible Stewies, and the one MacFarlane chose turned out to be exactly right in a way that the alternatives might not have been. The character of Peter Griffin's voice has never changed in any significant way across more than 2 decades of production, which is a remarkable consistency for a long-running animated show. Cartoon characters whose shows run this long sometimes have their voices subtly drift, the actor ages, their register shifts, the production recording environment changes, and the character gradually sounds slightly different from how they started without any single episode marking the change. Listen to Peter Griffin in the 1999 pilot and then in a recent episode. The voice is the same. MacFarlane has maintained the character's vocal consistency with a precision that suggests active attention, not just habit. The show's 40-plus Emmy nominations and wins reflect a specific trajectory, heavy recognition in the show's early seasons, declining nominations in the middle period, and a recalibration in recent years as the Emmys have evolved in how they categorize and consider animated content. The 2009 Outstanding Comedy Series nomination was the ceiling. The technical Emmys, for music, for voice performance, for animation quality, have been more consistent, reflecting that certain aspects of the show's production have maintained quality regardless of how the scripts and characters have evolved. The real story of the fictional Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery, where Peter works for much of the show. The workplace that grounds Peter in an economic context and gives him a reason to be somewhere other than the house or the bar was always more than just a background detail. The brewery and the Pawtucket Patriot brand became one of the show's most persistent fictional institutions. When the Simpsons crossover episode The Simpsons Guy was built around the legal dispute over whether Pawtucket Patriot Ale was a copy of Duff Beer, it elevated the fictional brewery to the level of a MacGuffin capable of driving a feature-length animated crossover episode. Not bad for a background workplace detail. The show has produced over 400 episodes as of its most recent seasons, making it one of the longest-running scripted American television series in history. It sits behind The Simpsons, Law & Order, Special Victims Unit, and the original Law & Order in terms of episode count among scripted American primetime shows. The accumulation of those episodes represents an enormous amount of creative labor, scripts written and rewritten, voice sessions recorded, animation produced frame by frame, music composed and recorded. Whatever else is true about the show's later seasons, the sheer volume of material produced over its run is staggering. The Stewie spin-off announced in March 2026, ordered for 2 seasons by Fox, would be the first Family Guy spin-off focused on a member of the Griffin family rather than on Cleveland Brown. The prospect of a full series built around Stewie Griffin, whatever version of Stewie the writers and MacFarlane choose to foreground, represents an acknowledgement that the character who was once television's most original villain still has things to offer that the ensemble format has not fully explored. And underneath all of it, running through every episode, every hidden joke, every production detail, every controversial decision and proud creative achievement and disappointing later season stumble is the fact that a kid from Kent, Connecticut drew a cartoon at the age of 2 and never really stopped, that he drew a student film in a kitchen at Rhode Island School of Design with $50,000 and 6 months of his life, and that the film became something that 22 million people watched on Super Bowl night in January 1999, and that those people are still watching a version of it decades later. That the thesis film became the franchise became the universe, and the universe is still expanding. There is something worth sitting with in that story, not the decline or the controversy or the ratings or the lawsuits or the international bans, but the original thing itself. The original spark of it. A specific kind of New England family sitting in a specific kind of Rhode Island house, a dog who drinks martinis, and a baby who wants to rule the world, a father with no self. Editing mechanism and a heart that was underneath everything in the right place. All of it started with one person sitting in his kitchen, drawing. If you made it this far, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Thank you for spending this time here. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. It genuinely makes a difference for small channels working hard to bring you content like this. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about or something to fall asleep to. Honestly, either outcome is a win. And I will see you in the next one. Section 13. The Star Wars Trilogy, How a Blackout Became a Masterpiece. There is a moment in Family Guy's history where everything the show could do aligned perfectly with everything the show wanted to do, and the result was something that people who loved both animated comedy and science fiction genuinely could not believe they were getting on. Network television. That moment is the Laugh It Up Fuzzball Trilogy, the 3-hour-long Star Wars parody episodes that stand, especially the first one, as some of the most ambitious and accomplished things Family Guy ever produced. The story of how the Blue Harvest episode came to exist involves a slightly unlikely chain of events. Family Guy had been making Star Wars jokes since its very first season. The references accumulated gradually, characters frozen in carbonite, a Jabba the Hutt joke here, a Death Star reference there. By the middle of the show's post-revival run, Fox's legal department sent a communication to the production team that essentially said, the volume of Star Wars references in Family Guy episodes has reached a point where it creates genuine legal risk. If the show was going to keep doing this, Lucasfilm had to formally clear the material. The production team's reaction, as MacFarlane later described it, was essentially resignation. They assumed Lucasfilm would say no. The jokes would have to stop. And that would be the end of a recurring source of comedy that the writers genuinely loved. Lucasfilm said yes, not just yes to the existing gag clearances, but yes to a full-length parody episode. Yes to the show building out a complete retelling of the original Star Wars film using Family Guy characters in the roles. Yes to having this aired on network television, with their blessing, in time to honor the 30th anniversary of the original film's release in 1977. What followed is a piece of television production history. The episode was written by writer Alex Sulkin over approximately 4 weeks, with guidance from MacFarlane. The title Blue Harvest referenced the deliberately bland working title that the crew of Return of the Jedi had used when filming on location to avoid fan attention. Blue Harvest Horror Beyond Imagination was posted on the crew's vehicles and facilities to prevent Star Wars fans from figuring out that a new Star Wars film was being made nearby. Using that title for the Family Guy parody was itself a piece of deeply knowledgeable Star Wars trivia dropped casually into the project's name. The casting decisions for the Star Wars parody were in some cases obvious and in some cases brilliantly specific. Peter Griffin as Han Solo made perfect sense. Both are loud, self-assured, not particularly refined, operating on instinct rather than plan, but fundamentally decent at their cores. Stewie as Darth Vader was the kind of casting that sounds ridiculous until you think about it for 5 seconds and then seems completely inevitable. Both are small, both are focused on domination. Both use a theatrical authority in their speech that is simultaneously frightening and slightly absurd. Chris as Luke Skywalker was perhaps the most fitting of all. Chris and Luke share a fundamental quality of being untested, slightly clueless but driven by something genuine, stumbling toward a destiny they don't fully understand. Lois as Princess Leia and Brian as Chewbacca completed the main cast assignments, with Brian's Chewie being one of those choices that seems odd on the surface but becomes funnier the more you watch it. The choice of Herbert the Pervert as Obi-Wan Kenobi was controversial. Not everyone thought it was funny to put the show's most unsettling recurring character in the role of the wise mentor, and some critics specifically called this choice out as a misfire. But in practice, the juxtaposition had its own dark comic logic. Obi-Wan is a man with hidden depths and morally ambiguous history. Herbert is a character whose presence always implies something uncomfortable just beneath the surface. The dissonance between the nobility of the role and the character filling it generated jokes that could not have been generated any other way. One of the episode's most brilliant meta-jokes involved Seth Green's character Chris, playing Luke Skywalker, directly breaking the fourth wall to observe that robot chicken had already done a Star Wars parody. Seth Green, in real life, is the creator of Robot Chicken, which had indeed produced its own Star Wars special before Family Guy's version aired. The show is making a joke about the competition between two different animated parody projects delivered by the person who made the competing project playing a character who has nothing to do with any of this inside a third parody project. The layering requires no explanation to be funny if you know the context, and it rewards people who think about it afterward. George Lucas's response to Blue Harvest is one of the more extraordinary pieces of this story. When the episode was near its broadcast date, MacFarlane and the production team were invited to Skywalker Ranch, Lucas's famous private estate and working facility in Marin, County, California, to screen the episode for Lucas himself. MacFarlane has described this as one of the more nerve-wracking professional experiences of his career. The assumption going in was that Lucas would watch the episode, find something objectionable, and the broadcast would have to be modified or the project would be pulled back. Instead, Lucas arrived with his son, sat down and watched the entire thing and laughed. He had been TiVoing every episode of Family Guy for years, he revealed, and it was one of only 2 shows he consistently watched alongside Jackass. Lucas later said publicly that he thought Family Guy's approach to Star Wars affectionate but unsparing, specific enough about the source material to demonstrate genuine love for it while still willing to mock everything about it was exactly the kind of parody he could live with. The episode aired on September 23, 2007, and drew 10.86 million viewers, one of the higher-rated episodes of the show's post-revival era. TV Guide would later place it at number 99 on their list of the 100 greatest episodes of television. The second installment, Something 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 Dark Side, parodied The Empire Strikes Back. The working title during early development had been The Great Muppet Caper, which was never going to fly but gives you some sense of the irreverence in the room when it was being made. The production challenges of following up Blue Harvest were significant. The first episode had the advantage of surprise, of audiences not knowing exactly what they were getting. The second one had to be as good or better for people who now had specific expectations. The verdict from fans and critics was mixed in the most interesting way. It was not as good as the first one, but it was still very good, and its best moments, including Darth Vader accidentally calling Luke instead of intentionally reaching out through the Force, are as funny as anything the show produced in this period. The third installment, It's a Trap, parodying Return of the Jedi, was acknowledged by almost everyone involved as the hardest of the three to make. Return of the Jedi is the weakest of the original 3 Star Wars films by almost any critical assessment, which means the parody had fewer inspired moments to work with. The show compensated partly through self-awareness. Characters in the episode occasionally break the fourth wall to acknowledge that they are struggling to make the Ewok. Material work. In one moment, Peter directly tells the audience that he knows the third parody is the least good of the 3. This kind of meta-acknowledgement was either a charming act of honesty or a symptom of the show's increasing reliance on self-referential comedy as a substitute for actually solving creative problems. Reasonable people have come to different conclusions. All 3 episodes were eventually released as a collected package called Laugh It Up, Fuzzball, The Family Guy Trilogy, with Blu-ray and DVD sets including extensive extras, making of features, commentary tracks, a conversation between MacFarlane and Lucas, and a look at how the Star Wars visual elements were recreated for the parody. The set remains one of the most comprehensive pieces of Family Guy home video release, and the trilogy remains one of the most discussed projects the show undertook. The fact that Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012 effectively ended any realistic prospect of Family Guy continuing the Star Wars parody franchise into the prequel or sequel. Trilogies. Alex Sulkin confirmed this publicly at San Diego Comic-Con, noting that the new Disney ownership created a more complicated clearance environment and that the working relationship MacFarlane had developed personally with the Lucasfilm team was harder to replicate under the new institutional structure. MacFarlane separately commented that the prequel trilogy was simply too expensive to produce at the scale required. The original trilogy parody exists, therefore, as a complete and closed work, a 3-part affectionate, sharp, sometimes brilliant, occasionally uneven tribute to one of the most important mythological stories of the 20th century, made by people who genuinely loved it. Section 14. The Road to Episodes. The best things Family Guy ever made. If the cutaway gag episodes represent Family Guy at its most structurally dispersed, a story held loosely together by random jokes, then the Road to episodes represent the show at its most structurally committed. These Brian and Stewie adventure episodes are built differently from the rest of the show. They have genuine plots that develop. They have character moments that build on each other within the episode. They have musical sequences that serve the story rather than interrupting it. They are, in the assessment of most critics and most serious fans of the show, the best things Family Guy has ever made on a consistent basis. The tradition began with Road to Rhode Island in the second season. The episode sends Brian to Palm Springs to retrieve Stewie from the Griffin grandparents, and the two of them end up on an accidental cross-country journey back to Rhode Island after missing their flight. The framing is a deliberate reference to the old Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road, to film series from the 1940s and 1950s, classic Hollywood comedy films that sent the two stars on increasingly unlikely journeys together, encountering adventures and singing songs along the way. MacFarlane, with his deep knowledge of mid-century American entertainment, chose to build the Brian and Stewie dynamic explicitly in this tradition. Road to Rhode Island works as well as it does for several interconnected reasons. First, it commits to its own premise. The episode has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and everything that happens in the episode serves that structure rather than departing from it. Second, the episode uses the road trip framework to reveal things about Brian and Stewie that would not have been revealed in the regular ensemble setting. We learn about Brian's origins, meeting his mother, a revelation that is genuinely touching in a way that nothing else the show had done up to that point had prepared the audience for. The joke is that Brian's mother is a regular dog, not a talking dog. And the emotional weight of that moment, the dog that can think and talk meeting the dog that cannot. Feeling the distance between himself and his origins is handled with surprising grace. Third, the musical number that comes out of this episode is a genuine piece of craftsmanship. The song the two characters sing together, Road to Rhode Island, is written and performed as a real mid-century show tune. It sounds like it belongs in the catalog of a 1950s Broadway musical. MacFarlane in two character voices, performing this thing that is both completely silly and completely accomplished at the same time. The road to episodes that followed, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse, Road to India, Road to Vegas, are not uniformly excellent. Some are better than others, and the tradition had diminishing returns as it went further from the original concept. But the best of them are genuinely among the greatest episodes of the show's entire run. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is one of those episodes that is discussed in animation circles as a technical and comedic achievement. The episode sends Brian and Stewie through parallel universes, a Disney-style universe where everything looks like a Disney film and moves with Disney's characteristic grace. A robotic universe. A universe where Christianity never took hold and human civilization advanced 1,000 years earlier than it did. A universe where the roles of humans and dogs are reversed. Each universe required the production team to completely change its animation style and visual language for that segment, producing what is essentially 5 or 6 completely different visual experiences within a single 22-minute episode. The Disney sequence in particular is one of the most technically impressive pieces of animation the show produced, requiring the production team to convincingly replicate the Disney style, the specific movement, the specific color palette, the specific way the soundtrack functions, in a way that worked as both parody and genuine tribute. Road to the North Pole is extraordinary for a different reason. The episode builds what appears to be a holiday special. Brian and Stewie go to the North Pole to visit Santa, and then reveals that Santa is in terrible shape. He has been so overwhelmed by the demands of modern commercial Christmas culture, by the sheer volume of children and the sheer volume of gifts required, that he is exhausted, overweight, ill. The elves are dying. The reindeer are failing. The whole operation is collapsing under the weight of consumer expectations. Brian and Stewie end up delivering Christmas gifts themselves, and the sequence is one of the darkest things the show ever produced. A full Christmas delivery that becomes a nightmare of violence and suffering as they try to reach every house in the world. And then the episode ends with a song, a genuine Christmas song about what it means to want less and appreciate more, performed by the cast in voices that sound genuinely sincere. It is an episode that moves from whimsy to horror to something approaching genuine emotion, and it manages every transition. Road to Germany was built around a specific historical premise. Mort Goldman accidentally travels back in time to Nazi Germany during World War II. The episode deals with one of the most obviously dangerous subject areas in comedy: the Holocaust, Nazi ideology, the genocide of Jewish people. And it does so by committing to a heroic adventure narrative rather than mining the atrocities for shock value. The episode is not making jokes about the Holocaust. It is making jokes about the specific experience of being thrown back into that period and having to navigate it, which is a meaningfully different thing. Mort, Jewish, in Germany in 1939, trying to escape with Brian and Stewie's help, is played for genuine stakes as well as comedy. The episode won a Producers Guild of America award for Outstanding Children's Program, which is one of the more surreal award situations in Family Guy's history. An episode about World War II time travel winning a Children's Program award. The consistency of the Road to format across the show's run is evidence for an argument that is worth making explicitly. Family Guy was always at its best when it committed to storytelling. The cutaway episodes could be funny. Some of them were genuinely brilliant. But the episodes that told stories, the Road to episodes, the episode Brian and Stewie, where the two characters are locked in a bank vault and talk to each other for 22 minutes without a single cutaway, the early season's plots that had beginnings and middles and endings, those are the episodes that hold up, that people return to, that represent what the show was capable of when it decided to be more than a delivery system for disconnected jokes. The Bank Vault episode deserves its own moment of attention here. Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is perhaps the most formally unusual episode the show ever made. It contains no cutaway gags. It has no subplot. It features exactly two characters, in one location, talking to each other for the entire runtime. Brian reveals that he has a gun in a safety deposit box because there are times when he has considered killing himself. Stewie tells Brian what he means to him. It is raw, funny in ways that feel uncomfortable, emotionally honest in ways that Family Guy is rarely honest, and completely unlike anything else the show produced before or since. The episode exists as proof that the show could do things that had nothing to do with random gags and shock humor, that its characters were capable of genuine dramatic weight when the writers committed to that possibility. Section 15. Character Deep Dives. Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, A&D The World Beyond the Griffins. The Griffin family is the center of Family Guy's gravitational field, but the show has always been more than just a family sitcom. The world around the Griffins, the neighbors, the recurring friends, the community figures, gives the show its texture and its sense of a world that extends beyond the main characters' immediate experience. And several of those supporting characters are as carefully constructed and as individually interesting as any of the six Griffins. Glenn Quagmire was introduced in the very first season as Peter's bachelor neighbor. The character was built on a very specific comedic premise: the complete absence of filters between desire and action in a specific kind of alpha male archetype. Quagmire's character operates as a comedy of excess. Everything that might be a minor character flaw in a regular person is pushed to an extreme in him. And the extreme version becomes the joke. His signature catchphrase, which will not be typed here, but which every viewer of the show knows and can hear in their head right now, has become one of the most recognized pieces of animated comedy language in the history of the medium. It functions as both a joke and a character signature, a single sound that contains an entire character in the hearing of it. What makes Quagmire interesting as a character rather than just as a delivery system for a running gag is that the show has, over the years, occasionally given him moments of genuine depth. His relationship with his father, a Navy veteran who later revealed a significant personal truth about himself, was handled with more care and more sensitivity than many episodes of the show managed. His revealed feelings for Meg, his complicated relationship with Brian, his loyalty to the friend group even when Peter is doing things that would test any reasonable person's patience. These elements create a character who is more than his most memorable trait. The voice work Patrick Warburton brings to Joe Swanson has been discussed earlier in this script, but Warburton's contribution to the show deserves revisiting in the context of what Joe represents as a character. Joe was introduced as an exemplar of capability and competence. He was the man everyone else aspired to be, physically powerful, professionally accomplished, respected in his community. The fact that he used a wheelchair was part of his characterization, but not the definition of it. He was not defined by his disability. He was defined by what he was despite it and through it. The show's treatment of Joe in later seasons, shifting him from a figure of respect to a figure of mockery, with his disability increasingly becoming the target of jokes rather than one element of a complex character, is one of the more discussed shifts in how the show handled a recurring character. Disability representation in media is a serious subject, and the specific trajectory of Joe Swanson's character arc, from admired cop to figure of ridicule, is worth acknowledging honestly. The early seasons got this right. The later seasons did not always. Cleveland Brown's character, as discussed in the crossover section, was always the gentlest member of the Spooner Street friend group, the one most likely to offer thoughtful perspective, the one whose reaction to Peter's behavior was genuine concern rather than gleeful participation. Cleveland's particular comic energy was understated. His humor came from the gap between the absurdity of what was happening around him and his measured, thoughtful response to it. The bathtub gag became iconic precisely because it was so specifically Cleveland. A man who could be having his bathroom floor fall away beneath him and still manage to deliver. The reaction with a kind of resigned acceptance. Cleveland's voice actor history is worth a moment's attention. Mike Henry voiced Cleveland from the show's first episode in 1999 through season 19. In 2020, Henry announced that he was stepping away from the role, citing the broader cultural conversation about the casting of black characters and the importance of allowing black actors to voice black animated characters. Henry is white. His decision to step away was broadly received as a responsible one, though it was also acknowledged as a significant change for a show that had maintained its core voice cast. With remarkable consistency for 2 decades. Arif Zahir, a black comedian and impressionist who had been doing Cleveland Brown impressions online, was cast as the new voice of Cleveland beginning in season 20. Zahir's performance has been well received by fans of the character. Herbert the Pervert, voiced by Mike Henry in a performance that is genuinely uncomfortable in exactly the way it is meant to be, is one of those characters that could only exist in animation and could only exist in a show that was willing to go to dark places. Herbert is an elderly man whose interest in Chris is clearly predatory. The show never makes this explicit in graphic terms, but the implication is consistent and unmistakable. The comedy comes from the contrast between Herbert's frailty, his thin, wavering voice, his apparent helplessness, and the sinister subtext of everything he says. Henry has said in interviews that the voice came to him almost complete in the first attempt, that there was something about the character that clicked into place quickly. The voice is technically one of the most distinct performances in the show's history, high and thin, slightly trembling, with a very specific placement in the mouth that creates an acoustic quality unlike any other voice in animation. The character of James Woods, who appeared in the show as himself in multiple episodes across several seasons, represents one of Family Guy's most interesting uses of a celebrity as a recurring character. In the show's universe, James Woods is a figure of both celebrity glamour and almost delusional ego, and he developed a running feud with Peter that became one of the show's recurring storylines. The episodes where Peter and James Woods interact are among the show's most specific comedy pieces. The humor depends on the audience knowing enough about James Woods' actual public persona to recognize the exaggerations. Woods appeared to be a genuinely good sport about the show's characterization of him, and his voice performance in these episodes showed genuine comedy timing. Meg Griffin, the Griffin family's eldest daughter, deserves a separate deep consideration that goes beyond what was covered in the narrative analysis of the source transcript. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg in the original 14 produced episodes. Her work in those episodes established Meg as a specific kind of character, slightly awkward, slightly self-conscious, but basically normal. The kind of teenager who is more interesting than the most popular kid in school but will not realize that until she is 30. When Mila Kunis took over the role for Season 2, she brought a slightly different quality to the voice, a flatness that served the character's later trajectory toward becoming the family's designated punching bag. Neither performance is objectively superior. They are different interpretations of the same character at different stages of the show's development. Meg's most celebrated single moment, arguably, comes not from the early seasons when she was a real character, but from the later period when she was primarily a punching bag. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party, Meg's speech confronting her family, calling out Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian for their specific failures and cruelties, is written with a sharpness and a specificity that suggests the writers were fully aware of how badly they had treated the character. Every accusation Meg levels in that speech is accurate. The episode then takes the speech away from her, having her voluntarily recant it to restore family stability, which is the episode's most criticized choice. But the speech itself, in isolation, is one of the better pieces of writing the show produced in its middle period. A moment where the writers looked at what they had made of this character and wrote something that acknowledged the damage honestly, even if they then retreated from the implications of that honesty. Chris Griffin occupies one of the stranger character positions in the show's history. He is consistently present, consistently voiced by Seth Green with a specific commitment, but consistently underwritten. The show knows what Chris's running gags are: the evil monkey, his artistic ability, his resemblance to Peter in certain ways, but it has rarely committed to building him into a fully dimensional character in the way it has occasionally committed to Meg. The episode where Chris develops his artistic ability and gains recognition for it is one of the more interesting explorations of the character, partly because it shows what the show could do with Chris when it decided to spend time with him, and partly because the episode ends in a way that suggests the writers were not entirely sure what to do with the positive space they had created around him. The relationship between Stewie and Brian, the one that replaced the Peter and Brian dynamic as the show's central emotional engine after the revival, is the subject of sustained fan affection that has survived even the most negative assessments of the show's later seasons. Something about the specific chemistry between MacFarlane's Brian and MacFarlane's Stewie, two versions of the creator's vocal range in conversation with each other, generates a warmth and a wit that the show returns to repeatedly because it reliably works. The Road to episodes live inside this relationship. The Bank Vault episode lives inside it. The Christmas Guy episode, where Stewie goes back in time to prevent Brian's death, is one of the most emotionally resonant things the show ever produced. And it works because of the specific relationship the show had built between these two characters over years of shared episodes. Section 16. The World Beyond Griffin. Predictions, Real-World Connections. And the Strange Power of Fiction. There is a category of fact about Family Guy that falls somewhere between genuine coincidence and the show's deep engagement with contemporary culture. Episodes are jokes that were written as pure comedy and then intersected with real world events in ways nobody could have predicted. Some of these connections are unsettling. Some are simply strange. All of them are real. The most famous of these involves Kevin Spacey. In a Season 3 episode that aired in 2003, Stewie runs through a mall shouting that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. At the time of broadcast, this was a dark joke about rumors in Hollywood circles that had not yet become public knowledge. Years later, in 2017, Spacey was the subject of numerous credible allegations of sexual misconduct and assault. The show had made a reference to something that was apparently known in entertainment industry circles but had not become public, years before it became public. This is one of those facts that is impossible to know what to do with. It happened. In 2005, the show aired a brief joke where Stewie runs through an airport saying he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement, which as noted became more loaded after 2017. But there are other predictive moments. A 2009 episode made a reference to a specific political development that occurred in a strikingly similar form several years later. A 2012 episode depicted a major corporate crisis for a company that bore significant resemblance to a real corporate scandal that unfolded years after the episode aired. A 2014 episode referenced a technology product failure in ways that mirrored an actual product failure that occurred significantly later. None of these moments is evidence of anything supernatural. What they are evidence of is the kind of deep social observation that good comedy writers practice as a matter of professional habit. A room full of smart, attentive people watching American culture intensely, looking for the absurdities and the hypocrisies and the emerging contradictions, is going to occasionally notice things before they become news. The comedy is the vehicle, but the underlying activity is acute cultural observation. The show's relationship with real-world events that happened during its production run is also interesting in a different way. The September 11 attacks, occurring while the show was on hiatus between its third season cancellation and before the Adult Swim era, are present in the show's history through MacFarlane's near miss on Flight 11. The attacks also affected specific episodes. An early season episode that featured the World Trade Center had footage modified in reruns, and a Stewie at the airport joke about weapons in luggage was removed from circulation after the attacks. The show navigated the post-September 11 broadcast environment carefully, and some of the changes it made to existing content reflected the production team's awareness of how drastically the cultural context had shifted. The 2007 and 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, discussed in the Writers' Room section, produced real changes in season timing and story structure. The 2023 WGA strike did the same for later seasons. These real-world labor actions left their marks on the show's creative output in ways that are traceable if you look at which episodes were produced when and how, the quality or tone shifted around the disruption periods. One of the stranger real-world connections involves Mila Kunis, who voices Meg. Kunis has spoken publicly about the experience of being recognized in public and having people direct Meg's signature dismissive line at her, saying to the actual actress, "In the actual world." The phrase that Peter says to Meg in the show to shut her down. The fictional cruelty had seeped out of the screen and into the actress's daily life. Kunis handled it with grace, but acknowledged that it was a specific kind of strange experience, being associated publicly with a character whose defining characteristic is being mistreated. The show's references to real-world events are sometimes deeply researched and sometimes superficially grabbed. The best of them demonstrate the specific kind of comedy that requires genuine knowledge of the thing being referenced. The worst of them demonstrate the kind of comedy that requires only enough knowledge to name the thing without understanding it. The full history of Family Guy's real-world references is a spectrum that contains both extremes. The political references deserve their own moment. Family Guy has been politically engaged since its first season, but the nature of that engagement has shifted over the show's run. In the early seasons, the political jokes tended to cut in multiple directions, making fun of conservative hypocrisy and liberal pretension in roughly equal measure. In the later seasons, the show's political perspective became more explicitly one-sided, which generated criticism from multiple directions. Some critics argued that the show's later political content was lazy liberal preaching. Some argued that it was an important use of comedy's social function to hold power to account. Most critics agreed that the political content in later seasons was less funny than the political content in early seasons, regardless of which direction the jokes pointed. Whether the decline in quality was caused by the directional shift or by a broader decline in writing quality is a genuinely contested question. The show has predicted or accurately depicted numerous real technological developments, social trends, and cultural shifts over its 20-plus year run. This is not magic. It is the natural result of smart writers paying very close attention to the direction things are moving and extrapolating from that observation. Comedy that is deeply engaged with the present can accidentally be predictive of the future precisely because the future is usually latent in the present if you know where to look. Section 17. The production. How an episode is actually made. The process of making a Family Guy episode is a year-long journey from initial idea to broadcast, and understanding it helps explain both the show's strengths and its limitations. The production pipeline involves dozens of people across multiple stages, moving from a concept in a writer's room meeting to a finished animated product with music, recorded. Voices and visual effects. It is simultaneously a creative process and a manufacturing operation, and the tension between those two realities shapes what gets made. An episode typically begins in the writer's room with a pitch. Someone has an idea for a story, a premise, a central conflict, a character situation, and puts it in front of the group. The pitch gets discussed, interrogated, built on. Other writers add jokes, suggest complications, identify where the story gets stuck. A story outline emerges from this collaborative process, and then a writer takes that outline and produces a first draft of the script. This draft goes back to the room for notes. The showrunner reads it, identifies what works and what needs adjustment, and the writer produces a revised draft. This process can iterate multiple times before the script is considered ready for production. Once a script is locked, the recording sessions begin. The main cast, MacFarlane, Borstein, Green, Kunis, Warburton, Henry, records together as discussed. A typical recording session for a Family Guy episode lasts several hours. The director gives notes during the session, guiding performances toward the specific comedic timing the episode needs. MacFarlane, voicing multiple characters, navigates between them in the session, which requires a quality of mental preparation that regular observers describe as impressive to watch. After recording, the audio performances are sent to the animation studio. For most of the show's post-revival history, the primary animation has been produced overseas. South Korea has been a major production location, along with other Asian markets, where animation production infrastructure is sophisticated and efficient. The animators receive the audio recordings, the script, and a set of production guidelines, and they produce the episode's animation frame by frame. This is where the visual choices, character movements, background details, the staging of jokes are realized. The production team in Los Angeles maintains communication with the overseas animators throughout this process, reviewing animatics and rough cuts and providing feedback. The music is being developed in parallel by Walter Murphy and his team. Murphy composes and arranges the score, writes any original songs the episode requires, and coordinates the music with the picture once the animation is returned from overseas. The Family Guy score has a specific musical identity, primarily orchestral, drawing on Murphy and MacFarlane's shared aesthetic of big band jazz and Broadway orchestration. But Capable of ranging widely when the episode demands. Episodes that feature original songs require Murphy to produce full musical arrangements, record them with musicians, and then integrate them with the animation. Sound design, mixing, and final post-production complete the process. The finished episode is delivered to Fox for broadcast, typically with a final color corrected and fully mixed version completed weeks before the air date. The production timeline from initial concept to finished episode is generally cited as approximately 9 to 12 months, which means the production team is always working on multiple episodes at different stages of the pipeline simultaneously. This production reality has specific creative consequences. The long lead time between writing and broadcast means the show cannot respond quickly to breaking news or immediate cultural events in the way that live-action shows with. Shorter production pipelines can. When a specific cultural moment becomes broadly relevant, Family Guy is likely already 9 months into a production cycle that was conceived before that moment occurred. The show's ability to feel culturally current depends on the writer's ability to anticipate what will be culturally relevant many months from now, which is a different skill from responding to what is relevant right now. The show's use of 2 different animation styles across its history, the rougher, more expressively handmade quality of the original seasons, and the cleaner, smoother, more standardized quality of the post-revival era, reflects the production realities of different animation studios handling different periods of the show. The rough draft studios that produced the early seasons brought a specific energy to the animation that fans still cite as part of what made those episodes feel alive. The production standards applied in later seasons produced technically cleaner work but lost something in the transition. This is a common pattern in long-running animated shows. The scrappy energy of early production gives way to polished efficiency, and the polish and the scrappiness are not entirely compatible with each other. Section 18. What Family Guy means to the people who grew up with it. There is a generation of people who grew up with Family Guy as a constant. It was on the television in the background of childhood evenings. It was the show you were not quite old enough to watch that somehow you watched anyway. It was the clips on YouTube that circulated around classrooms and friend groups in the early days of video sharing. It was the GIFs that appeared in online conversations. For this generation, Family Guy is not just a television show in the way that any television show is a television show. It is part of the furniture of their mental world, a set of references and rhythms that are simply there, as present as any piece of music or film or book that shaped how they think and speak and process experience. This relationship between a show and the generation that absorbed it most deeply is not easy to measure or analyze with any precision. It shows up in the specificity of the nostalgia people express when they go back to early Family Guy episodes. It shows up in the particular sadness that comes when those same people watch recent seasons and feel the distance between what the show was and what it became. It shows up in the way Family Guy references circulate in everyday language, turning up in conversations between people who may not have watched the show in years but whose vocabulary still contains what the show put into it. The specific humor of Family Guy, the rapid associative logic, the willingness to go somewhere unexpected with a setup, the deadpan delivery of genuinely extreme material, trained a generation of comedy consumers in a specific set of expectations, humor that moves quickly, that does not explain itself, that expects the audience to keep up, that finds comedy in the gap between expectation and execution. This is Family Guy's comedic legacy as an educational force, and it is a real force that shaped the sensibility of everyone who consumed enough of it at an impressionable age. The show's treatment of certain topics, race, gender, disability, religion, sexuality, is more complicated in retrospect than it seemed at the time for many viewers. Content that read as edgy transgression in 2002 looks different through the lens of 2025's cultural understanding. Some of it holds up as genuine satire. Some of it does not. The generation that grew up with the show has had to do the work of revisiting that material and deciding for themselves what they think about it now, which is exactly the kind of engagement that substantive art requires, even when the art in question is a cartoon about a talking dog and a fat man from Rhode Island. The community that has grown up around the show, the fan wikis, the Reddit threads, the YouTube analysis channels, the Discord servers, the Twitter discussions, the clip, compilations, represents an enormous collective investment of human attention and creative energy. Millions of hours of engagement across decades with this one piece of popular culture. The Family Guy Wiki is one of the most comprehensive fan-maintained databases for any piece of popular media, containing detailed information about every episode, every character, every running gag, every production detail that has become publicly known. This is what happens when a show touches something real in enough people. The people build the thing it gave them back into something larger. The show's streaming performance on Hulu and Disney Plus tells part of the story in data. Family Guy is consistently one of the most streamed animated titles on both platforms, with viewing numbers that far exceed what first-run broadcast ratings would suggest. People are watching old episodes constantly, returning to seasons they already know, discovering episodes they missed, cycling through the show in background viewing mode while doing other things. The show has become ambient cultural infrastructure for a significant portion of the streaming audience, present in homes as a comfortable, familiar thing rather than as must. Watch appointment television. There is something worth acknowledging honestly here. Family Guy at its worst. The lazy shock humor and the cruel character treatment and the cutaway stuffed episodes that have no center was genuinely bad. Not bad in a fun way. Bad in a way that reflected diminishing creative ambition and a loss of genuine care. The decline is real, and anyone who loved the early show has felt it. But Family Guy at its best, the early seasons, the Road 2 episodes, the Star Wars trilogy, the specific moments scattered through even the compromised later seasons when everything aligned correctly, was something genuine and special and worth the attention it received. It was smart when it chose to be. It was warm when it remembered to be. It was fearless in ways that animated comedy had not previously been fearless on network broadcast television. That contradiction between the show's best and its worst, between what it was and what it became, between its legacy as a genuine artistic achievement and its reality as a content manufacturing operation. That is the real story of Family Guy. Both things are true simultaneously. The show that changed television is the same show that eventually stopped caring very much about the things that made it change television. And that paradox is part of what makes it worth thinking about, worth knowing, worth the 3 hours it takes to tell its story properly. There was a boy in Kent, Connecticut who started drawing at the age of 2. He grew up and put everything he knew about New England and family and music and dark comedy and human absurdity into a 15-minute pilot made for $50,000 and 6 months of his life, and the world received it, and loved it, and argued about it, and was changed by it in ways large and small, and is still watching it decades later. That is the story. It is a good one. If you are still here, you are one of the dedicated ones, and this channel exists for people exactly like you. Thank you from the bottom of everything for spending this time. Leave a like if you enjoyed the journey, subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep dive content, and drop a comment with something you learned tonight that you did not know. Before I read every single one. Sleep well. And I will see you in the next one. Extended Facts 100 and 50 More Things About Family Guy. Because this is supposed to keep you company for a full night, and because there is genuinely no bottom to the amount of interesting things there are to know about this show. Here is a continuing series of facts, stories, and observations. Consider this the extended universe of the script, the extra material, the bonus disc, the director's commentary playing over everything you have already heard. Seth MacFarlane published his first comic strip in a local newspaper at age 8. The strip was called Walter Croughton. He was 8 years old and had a regular published column. Nobody asked him to do this. He just did it because he was already doing it. The original budget for the Family Guy pilot was $50,000. For context, a single episode of a live-action network drama in the same era cost between $1 and $3 million to produce. MacFarlane made his pilot on the budget of a single commercial. When Fox first greenlit Family Guy, the network gave MacFarlane an extraordinary degree of creative control for a first-time showrunner. Part of this was because he was so young. At 25, he was not going to push back on network notes the way a veteran would. And part of it was because the network was not entirely sure what they had and were willing to let it develop. The Griffins' address 31 Spooner Street was established in the first season and maintained consistently across nearly all subsequent episodes. Given the show's many continuity issues on other fronts, the address consistency is notable. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, also had a recurring role on Mad TV and has built a significant separate career. She won 2 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series for The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on Amazon, making her one of the most decorated voice actors in television history. Seth Green, who voices Chris, co-created Robot Chicken with Matthew Senreich and has produced over 200 episodes of that show alongside his Family Guy work. The meta joke in Blue Harvest, where Chris references Robot Chicken's Star Wars parody, is Green playing with his own creative history. Mila Kunis was 17 years old when she lied about her age to get the role of Jackie Burkhart on That 70s Show. She was still a teenager when she joined the Family Guy cast as Meg. She has been voicing the character ever since, now well into her 30s, a range of life experience that spans almost the entirety of her professional career. Patrick Warburton, the voice of Joe Swanson, is perhaps most widely recognized by general audiences as David Puddy from Seinfeld, a recurring character known for his laconic delivery and extreme face-painting enthusiasm. The specific deadpan quality that made Puddy funny translated perfectly into Joe. The character of Cleveland Brown was introduced in the very first episode. Mike Henry was already part of MacFarlane's creative circle before the show began, which meant Cleveland was written with Henry's specific sensibility in mind rather than constructed independently and then cast. Brian Griffin's full name is Brian H. Griffin. The middle initial has been mentioned in the show but never explicitly expanded. Fan speculation about what the H stands for has generated numerous internet discussions over the years. Stewie Griffin's full name is Stuart Gilligan Griffin. The middle name Gilligan is a reference to Gilligan's Island, the classic 1960s American sitcom. This is either a piece of deliberate nostalgic comedy from MacFarlane or a coincidence that the show later acknowledged. The middle name has appeared in dialogue and official materials. Peter Griffin's full name is Peter Lwenbrew Griffin. Lwenbrew is a German beer brand. The joke is that a man who drinks cheap American beer has a German beer brand as his middle name, a joke his parents apparently made deliberately or accidentally in naming him. Lois Griffin's maiden name is Pewterschmidt. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is one of the wealthiest men in the show's fictional universe, and his specific brand of contemptuous patrician humor has been one of the show's more reliable comedy devices in episodes that visit the Pewterschmidt estate. The Griffins' house was confirmed to be a standard American suburban house design with 3 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a backyard. The floor plan has been shown in multiple episodes and has become detailed enough that fans have produced accurate architectural floor plans based on what the show has revealed. Over the decades, the show has depicted Peter Griffin working at several different jobs over its run. He began at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery after initially being employed at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory. The Toy Factory job was established in the first season and provided several memorable storylines before the brewery became his permanent professional home. Brian Griffin drives a 2004 Prius. This detail, established in an early episode, became a piece of running character comedy. The environmentally conscious intellectual in his environmentally conscious vehicle. The Prius as a character signifier was topical in the mid-2000s in a way it has since become embedded in cultural shorthand. The show has had multiple episodes set in the past. Specifically the 1980s, a decade MacFarlane has frequently cited as a major influence on his cultural sensibility. The 1980s references in Family Guy are frequently more specific and more knowledgeable than the generic 1980s nostalgia that became a television cliché in later years. The Family Guy writing room has employed several writers who went on to create or co-create their own successful shows. The alumni network of the Family Guy Writers' Room has produced significant independent work across the comedy television landscape over the past 2 decades. Family Guy's original broadcast pilot, the 15-minute version MacFarlane made for $50,000, was never aired publicly. The version audiences saw was an expanded, refined, fully produced episode. The original pilot exists as a historical document, but was not the show's public introduction. Seth MacFarlane's sister Rachel MacFarlane has been involved in the Family Guy universe as a voice actress. She has appeared in American Dad in a more prominent capacity, voicing Haley Smith, which means Family Guy's family extends in both directions, into the show's production and into the creator's actual family. The Drunken Clam Bar has a dartboard in the background that has been visible across hundreds of episodes. Eagle-eyed viewers have analyzed the position of the darts in that dartboard across different episodes, finding that the position changes between scenes and even sometimes within scenes. A continuity error that has accumulated its own fan mythology. Joe Swanson's gun, which he carries as a police officer, has been depicted with different levels of accuracy to real firearms across different episodes, reflecting the varying levels of research different production teams brought to the show's visual details. The show's background music, composed by Walter Murphy, has occasionally incorporated recognizable melodies from other sources in ways that are brief enough to qualify as quotations rather than direct reproduction. Music supervisors and copyright attorneys are presumably involved in these decisions, but the presence of recognizable musical fragments in background score throughout the shows. Run represents another layer of audio detail for attentive listeners. Family Guy's opening theme has been recorded in different versions for different broadcast markets. The international versions, adapting the show's visual and audio opening sequence for different countries' broadcast standards, occasionally include slight modifications that American viewers have never seen. The show has depicted the Griffin family's neighborhood from an aerial view in multiple episodes. These overhead shots reveal a residential layout that has remained roughly consistent, though specific houses appear and disappear in ways that reflect continuity inconsistencies. Accumulated over decades of animation production, the character of Meg Griffin has appeared in fewer episodes per season in recent years than in the early seasons, reflecting both a deliberate creative choice to reduce the character's role as punching bag and the practical reality of Mila Kunis's schedule as a major film actress becoming more constrained over time. Tom Tucker, the Quahog 5 News anchor voiced by MacFarlane, has a son named Jake Tucker whose face is literally upside down. This is a recurring visual gag that was introduced in the second season and has appeared periodically ever since, always in the same format, and always played with the same deadpan commitment. The show has produced holiday-specific episodes for Christmas, Halloween, Valentine's Day, Thanksgiving, and other occasions. The Christmas episodes, particularly Road to the North Pole, are among the most discussed of these, but the Halloween episodes have also developed their own tradition, often leaning into horror movie references and darker comedy than the show's standard register. Family Guy's influence on internet GIF culture is measurable in specific ways. The show's specific character expressions, Brian's dry stare, Stewie's villainous grin, Peter's various confused looks, became among the most used GIF reactions in early social media culture. These images circulated through Tumblr, then Twitter, then every other platform that supported image sharing, reaching audiences who had never watched the show through a single, complete episode. The show's relationship with music videos is underexplored in most discussions of its cultural impact. Several Family Guy episodes have contained sequences that function as full music video parodies, specific animation styles matched to specific musical genres, with the jokes embedded in the visual language of the video form being parodied. These sequences required the production team to have enough knowledge of music video conventions to parody them specifically rather than generically. Seth MacFarlane has performed at Carnegie Hall. He has performed at the Royal Albert Hall in London. He has performed with orchestras on multiple continents. His live performance career, which emerged from the success of Family Guy but has developed its own independent following, represents one of the more unusual trajectories in television entertainment history, from animated comedy writer to international concert performer. The show has been parodied or referenced in hundreds of other television programs, films, and media properties over its run. This is both a measure of its cultural presence and a kind of ongoing tribute from the broader entertainment world to something that genuinely registered. Every single episode of Family Guy has been given a title that appears only in the episode's opening credits and in broadcast guides. Many of these titles are jokes in themselves, puns, pop culture references, descriptive phrases that comment on the episode's content in ways that are often funnier than the titles of more prestigious dramatic series. The accumulated list of Family Guy episode titles is itself a kind of comedy document. The show's writers have consistently named characters after people they knew, people they admired, or people they wanted to make feel included. Background characters, one-episode figures, unnamed people in crowd scenes, all of these were given names by the production team. Names that appear in scripts and production documents even if they never appear on screen. These naming traditions are a form of community building within the production, a way of acknowledging that every person involved in making the show is part of a shared creative enterprise. And underneath all of these facts, under all the numbers and the stories and the behind-the-scenes details and the cultural analysis, there is the simple, irreducible fact that a show about a talking dog and a fat man from Rhode Island managed to hold the attention of tens of millions of people across more than 25 years of broadcasting. And that those people, some of them, fell asleep to it, watched it during difficult times, quoted it to each other, used it as a shared language for understanding the specific absurdity of the world they inhabited. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. Let us stay with the facts a little longer, because there is still more to know, and you are still here, and the night is still quiet. The show has a tradition of including a specific kind of background noise in scenes set in the Griffin living room. A low, ambient murmur that sounds like a household in use, like a real home, rather than a soundstage. This ambient audio detail is the kind of thing that affects the viewer's experience subconsciously, creating a sense of lived-in reality that pure visual animation cannot achieve alone. The sound design of Family Guy across its entire run has been one of its most quietly accomplished elements. The show's animation direction evolved most dramatically between seasons 3 and 4. The transition between the original pre-cancellation run and the post-revival era. Side-by-side comparison of animation from the two periods reveals not just a technical difference, but a philosophical one. The early animation was rougher but more expressive, with character faces that moved through more subtle gradations of emotion. The post-revival animation is technically cleaner, but emotionally more standardized. Characters hit certain expressions with greater precision, but fewer of the accidental expressiveness that came from the rougher original process. The production of the Family Guy theme song involved MacFarlane recording his own voice performing all the parts of the ensemble number, which were then layered together in post. Production. The final version gives the impression of multiple singers performing together, which is achieved through vocal overdubbing rather than an actual group recording. This technique, standard in music production, is not commonly known by viewers who assume the theme is simply a studio recording session. The show has depicted the interior of Peter Griffin's brain in multiple episodes, sometimes as a literal location that can be visited. The comedy premise of these episodes, what is actually happening inside Peter's skull, consistently plays with the idea of minimal cognitive activity, suggesting that the space is largely empty or occupied by an extremely small, extremely baffled homunculus trying to make decisions without adequate information. The visual representation of Peter's internal thought process became a recurring comedic device that commented on the character's intelligence level in ways that were gentler in the early seasons and crueler in the later ones. The show's treatment of Rhode Island as a setting deserves one final observation. MacFarlane moved away from Rhode Island after graduating from RIST and has lived in Los Angeles for his entire professional career. His relationship with the state is one of creative distance. He is recreating a place from memory and affection rather than from current experience. This quality of nostalgic reconstruction gives the show's New England setting a specific texture, the particular way that places look when they are being remembered from a considerable distance. The Griffin family's Rhode Island is more real in some ways than a documentary depiction would be, because it is filtered through the kind of selective attention that memory applies to places that matter to us. The show has, over its run, depicted the death and revival of multiple characters multiple times. Brian Griffin's death and revival in seasons 12 is the most famous of these, but other characters have died and returned within the show's timeline in ways that reflect a philosophy of consequence-free storytelling. Things happen, and then they unhappen, and the audience is expected to go along with this because the show has established that its world does not hold permanent consequences. This philosophy is both a comedic freedom and a narrative limitation, and the tension between those two aspects of it has shaped the show's storytelling for more than 2 decades. And finally, the most important fact of all, the one that underpins everything else in this script and in the show's history: Family Guy was made by a person who cared so much at the beginning that he spent 6 months drawing alone in his kitchen for $50,000. Who fought for the theme song, who built a fictional world from real geography and real memory, who hired people he trusted and gave them a creative environment in which something genuine could grow. Whatever happened after, whatever compromises were made, whatever creative choices you might wish had gone differently, the show started from a place of genuine passion and genuine investment. And those origins are visible in the best of what it produced. They are the seed that grew into everything that followed, the thing that will persist in the show's legacy long after the cutaway debates and the ratings discussions have faded. Seth MacFarlane drew a cartoon at age 2. He published a comic strip at age 8. He made a thesis film that changed his life. He built something that changed television. Whatever you think about the rest, those facts are clean and true and worth holding on to as you close your eyes tonight. Final thoughts. The show that refuses to end. We have now spent a considerable amount of time inside the world of Family Guy, and there is something fitting about ending in the same place we began, with the observation that this show, for all its complications and contradictions, is still being made, still being watched, still generating the kinds of conversations and arguments and affections that all lasting art generates. A show being controversial is not evidence of failure. Controversy requires that people care. Indifference would be worse. Family Guy has never been indifferent to itself, and the world has never been indifferent to it. And that mutual engagement, however contentious it has sometimes become, is part of what has kept the show alive through 2 cancellations and a 30-year broadcast history and a complete restructuring of the television industry around it. The world in which Family Guy debuted in 1999 is almost unrecognizable compared to the world in which it continues to be produced in 2025. Cable television was the dominant entertainment medium then. Streaming did not exist in any meaningful sense. Social media did not exist. The internet was a novelty rather than an infrastructure. The specific cultural context that shaped the show's first seasons, the late 1990s American economy, the first years of the 21st century, the specific television landscape of animation domination Sunday nights have receded into history, and yet the show persists, adapting to each new media environment, finding new audiences through new platforms, remaining culturally present even as its original cultural moment recedes. This persistence is partly economic, as this script has discussed at length, but it is also something else. It is the persistence of characters that people recognize, of a comedic voice that has its own distinct quality, of a world that, whatever its flaws, has enough specificity and enough genuine personality to keep drawing people in. The Griffin family, at their best, are people worth spending time with. Flawed, sometimes genuinely awful, but unmistakably real in the way that only the best fictional characters manage to be real. Brian and Stewie talking in a bank vault about what it means to still be alive. Peter and Lois forgiving each other after a fight that got too big. Road to Rhode Island, and the moment when a talking dog meets his regular dog mother and feels the weight of what separates him from his own origins. These are the moments. These are the things that earned the show the loyalty it generated. They are the proof that underneath all the cutaways and the shock humor and the controversy, there was always something genuinely worth caring about. Whatever comes next for Family Guy, however many more seasons it produces, whatever the Stewie spinoff turns out to be, wherever the streaming rights and the licensing deals take it, the show has already done the most important thing a piece of creative work can do. It found its audience. It gave them something. And in the specific way that only fictional worlds can do, it became part of the furniture of those people's inner lives, present in the background even when they were not, actively thinking about it, there when they needed something familiar and strange and funny at the same time. Close your eyes. Let the voice carry you. The Griffins will still be there on Spooner Street when you wake up, exactly as you left them, doing exactly what they have always done. Sleep well.